Ju-won is a man who has never experienced a woman's touch in his entire life. The only source of comfort he ever had were his parents, who tragically lost their lives in a car accident on Christmas Eve. Since then, every Christmas has become a lonely routine for him, wandering the streets aimlessly while everyone else enjoys the holiday with their wives and children. Seeing all those happy families only makes him feel more isolated, and because of his tall stature, people tend to avoid him, leaving him with no one to talk to. While wandering around as usual, Ju-won notices an old man dressed in a Santa costume begging by the roadside. Feeling sorry for the old fellow, he decides to give him some money rather than waste it on beer and junk food. Grateful for the kindness, the old man asks Ju-won whether he has any wishes in life. Ju-won immediately finds the old man somewhat creepy and tries to leave, but the persistent Santa refuses to let him go. Left with no choice, Ju-won casually lies and says that he wishes to win the lottery. However, the old man sees right through him and insists that he reveal the desire buried deep inside his heart. Those words strike a chord with Ju-won, making him emotional. After thinking about it, he realizes that all he truly wants is a happy family, a beautiful wife, and an adorable daughter. The old man confidently promises that his wish will come true, and if he fails, he will stop calling himself Santa. Thinking the man is just some overenthusiastic Santa fanatic, Ju-won leaves him behind and returns to his old, cramped apartment. That night, he boards a late-night train, only to find himself surrounded by couples. Not wanting to watch them any longer, he closes his eyes and falls asleep. Little does he know that it will be the final time he sleeps on Earth. When he opens his eyes again, he finds himself inside a cage mounted on a carriage, surrounded by several strangers. Everyone around him looks miserable and half-starved, as though they have not eaten in days. Compared to them, Ju-won seems to be in slightly better shape, but he quickly notices that he is not wearing any clothes and begins to shiver from the cold. Looking around, he hears the soldiers driving the carriage, speaking a language he cannot understand. He soon notices that every person inside the cage is restrained with heavy shackles, making it obvious that they are part of a slave caravan. It is only then that Ju-won realizes that the creepy Santa somehow sent him to another world, even stealing Truck Kun's usual job. Before he can fully process the situation, the freezing cold starts getting to him. While searching for a way to survive, his eyes land on the corpse of a slave who still has clothes on. Although he feels guilty about taking garments from the dead, he knows he has no other option if he wants to avoid freezing to death. After putting on the clothes, Ju-won sits down and begins thinking about that strange Santa. He wonders whether becoming a slave was somehow supposed to fulfill his dream of having a loving family, or if that old man simply wanted to prank him. Deep down, he still hopes that all of this is just a dream and that he will wake up in his room and enjoy a nice, warm bath. Several days pass like this, and Ju-won gradually adapts to life among the slaves. His cheeks have become sunken, and his once decent appearance now looks completely disheveled. Starving and exhausted, he desperately wishes for this nightmare to end. Eventually, the caravan stops at a village, and the soldiers line up the slaves to be sold to the locals. For the first time in a while, Ju-won sees a ray of hope. Even if becoming a slave is terrible, he knows that at least he will be fed once a day according to the rules. Confident in his appearance and tall physique, he even believes that the wealthiest person in the village will purchase him. Unfortunately, reality proves far crueler than he imagined. Not a single person even glances in his direction. The same thing continues throughout the journey. Every time the caravan reaches a village, the slaves are sold one after another while Ju-won is always left behind. Gradually, he loses all hope and starts giving up on life itself. Filled with resentment, he curses the creepy Santa for lying to him about granting him a life of happiness and instead throwing him into this hellhole. Unable to endure the misery any longer, Ju-won decides to end everything by driving a nearby fork into his neck. Just as he is about to do it, an angel suddenly appears before him and extends a helping hand. Ju-won freezes in place, completely captivated by the breathtaking beauty of the woman standing before him. In her hand is a piece of bread that looks more appetizing than anything he has ever eaten, even at a 5-star restaurant. The woman says something to him, but Ju-won cannot understand a single word, not because he is incapable of learning their language, but because his mind is completely occupied by the beauty of the woman and the sight of the adorable little daughter standing beside her. Previously, inside a shabby and worn-down room, the beautiful woman Lizzie was having dinner with her daughter. Since the meal portions were quite small, Lizzie worried that her daughter would not have enough to eat, so she gave the child her own share as well. The little girl was delighted, but she did not want her mother to stay hungry. She split the food into 2 portions, keeping one half for herself and handing the other half back to Lizzie. Just as Lizzie was about to thank her, loud knocking suddenly echoed from the door. The village chief instructed her not to open the door completely and to simply listen to what he had to say. He informed her that a group of slaves had been brought by the soldiers and that one of them would be purchased to become her husband. He told her to prepare herself because she would soon be moving back to the mountain with him. Before leaving, he also reminded her to prepare some food for the soldiers as they would be arriving at daybreak. The news left Lizzie stunned because her previous marriage had been nothing short of a nightmare. Every day, she had suffered suffered beatings and endured endless misery. She had no desire to relive that painful chapter of her life and briefly considered running away. However, her thoughts soon turned to the young girl, the daughter her former husband had left behind from an earlier marriage. Lizzie had only come to know the child some time ago, and she could not bring herself to abandon her. The young girl seemed to sense her mother's distress. Wrapping her tiny arms around Lizzie, she tried her best to comfort her. Seeing this gesture eased Lizzie's sorrow, and she eventually calmed down before putting the girl to bed. The child did not even have a name yet. That was why Lizzie feared that if she married again, both of them might end up trapped in another nightmare. That nightmare had begun many years earlier, when Lizzie's father sold her for nothing more than a rabbit skin. A man living on the village mountain bought her, and before she even had the chance to unpack her belongings, he arrived and started beating her for being late. Life only grew worse after that. Day after day, she suffered abuse and torture. Her arms and legs might have been broken long ago, if not for the young girl, who appeared in her life like a ray of light, becoming an angel within her living hell. One day, after brutally beating Lizzie again, the man headed into the forest to hunt animals and never came back. Later, the village chief informed her that he had been killed by a wild beast and that his body was never recovered. Lizzie was overjoyed when she heard the news, but her happiness quickly faded when reality set in. During those backward times, a woman without a husband was viewed as useless and incapable of surviving on her own. Because of this, Lizzie chose to face her fears instead of running away, as she could not leave her daughter behind. The next morning, Lizzie prepared herself and even baked several pieces of bread. Carrying the food with her, she made her way outside toward the parked carriages. There, she noticed a man attempting to unalive himself by pressing a fork against his neck. The sight instantly reminded her of her own painful past and the time she had once considered using a fork to end her own life. In the end, she had never gone through with it. Without hesitation, Lizzie rushed over and stopped the man from unaliving himself. Looking closer, she saw his hollow cheeks and messy appearance and offered him a piece of bread. Before she could say anything further, the village chief arrived and instructed her to return to her hut, assuring her that he would take care of purchasing the slaves. Lizzie and the young girl gave the man one final glance before leaving. That man was none other than Ju-won. He could hardly believe that someone had offered him bread at the very moment he had been prepared to unalive himself. Instantly, everything else vanished from his mind as his attention became completely fixed on the food. Unfortunately, before he could take even a single bite, the soldiers dragged him out of the cell and brought him before the village chief. Ju-won and two other slaves knelt on the ground while soldiers stood around them. Moments later, one soldier pulled out a knife and sliced their arms, drawing blood. He smeared the blood onto 2 sheets of paper, and to Ju-won's surprise, the papers immediately emitted a faint blue glow. The sight left him astonished. He wondered whether this was some kind of magic. It also made him increasingly curious about this strange world, where slavery still existed and magic seemed to be real. Once the contracts were completed, a soldier leaned over and whispered something into the village chief's ear. The chief nodded before approaching Ju-won to examine his condition. At the same time, Lizzie and her daughter returned to their hut. A village woman soon arrived with enough supplies to last them several days. She informed Lizzie that her future husband did not understand their language, so communicating with him would likely be difficult at first. Noticing Lizzie's lingering fear, the woman tried to reassure her. She explained that although the man appeared to be a commoner, his hands were unusually soft, more like those of a noble than a laborer. She also reminded Lizzie that nobody in the village had liked her former husband, and that they had only tolerated him because he served as the mountain keeper. The woman added that if her new husband could perform the same work, they might be able to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Lizzie quietly replied that she did not care whether her husband was skilled or successful. Her only wish was that he would not be a violent man. Just then, the village chief pushed open the door and led Lizzie's new husband into the hut. To her surprise, it was the same man she had stopped from unaliving himself earlier that day. Seeing him from up close, she finally realized how tall and imposing he was, which made her somewhat nervous. Ju-won recognized her as the woman who had given him bread, but he could not understand why she appeared so frightened. Before he could make sense of the situation, the village chief grabbed his arm and placed him beside Lizzie and her daughter. Then he firmly linked their arms together, making them look like an awkward newly married family. Although Ju-won could not understand a single word being spoken, the atmosphere and the situation made it obvious enough. He realized that he was being married off to the woman. The scene reminded him of the creepy Santa. At that moment, he understood that Santa had not been lying when he promised him a cute rabbit-like wife and an adorable mongoose daughter. Ju-won could not help but feel happy, believing that he was finally living the dream he had always wanted. However, he still can't help feeling furious at that creepy Santa for putting him through so much trouble. Ju-won silently vows that if he ever runs into that Santa again, he'll make sure the old man suffers even more than he did. The furious look on Ju-won's face frightens both Lizzie and the young girl, girl, who are still traumatized from everything they went through earlier. Meanwhile, the village chief is pleased to see Ju-won looking so energetic. Since being a mountain keeper is an exhausting job that only a strong person can handle, he decides to test whether Ju-won is truly qualified for the role. He signals one of the villagers to step forward and challenge Ju-won to a handshake. Although Ju-won can't understand a single word they're saying, he can easily sense what they want. Without holding back, he grips the villager's hand with all his strength. The man immediately regrets challenging him as Ju-won nearly crushes his hand, despite looking completely effortless while doing it. Satisfied with the result, the village chief moves on to the next test, hunting. He hands Ju-won a bow and gestures for him to shoot a wild rabbit. Having never touched a bow before, Ju-won only knows archery from watching Olympic competitions. He imitates the posture as best he can before releasing the arrow. Although the shot narrowly misses the rabbit, the village chief still seems impressed and applauds his attempt. Ju-won remains completely confused about what's happening until Lizzie and the young girl approach him carrying a basket. Looking at Lizzie up close, he can't help thinking she's incredibly beautiful. The realization that she is now his bride causes him to blush. Seeing his reaction, the village chief quickly concludes that Ju-won has probably never been around women before. Smiling to himself, he decides to leave the three of them alone so the newly formed family can begin getting comfortable with one another. Now that everyone else has left, Lizzie becomes even more nervous. She has no idea how to interact with her new husband, but she still knows she must fulfill her responsibilities as a wife. She carefully spreads a cloth across the ground before taking the food out of the basket. She serves a meal to Ju-won, gives a portion to the little girl, and finally prepares one for herself. The atmosphere is painfully awkward as they quietly eat together. Ju-won has no idea how to ease the tension. Since he doesn't understand their language, he can't even introduce himself. Once again, he finds himself silently cursing that creepy Santa for throwing him into such a random place. Even so, deep down he feels grateful. Without Santa's interference, he never would have had a family like this. After everyone finishes eating, the village chief returns to guide them to the mountain cabin where they will be living. The journey up the mountain is long, steep, and exhausting, making it especially difficult for the malnourished mother and daughter. Ju-won quickly notices how much they're struggling. Since he's now the man of the household, he naturally wants to help. He walks over to Lizzie, who immediately tenses up, unsure of what he's about to do. Ju-won has always been a gentleman and would never touch a woman without permission. Unfortunately, he has no way to explain himself because of the language barrier, and there isn't enough time to gesture either, so he simply lifts both Lizzie and the little girl into his arms and continues climbing toward the mountaintop. As he carries them, he realizes just how light they are. It becomes painfully obvious that both of them have been severely underfed. That thought strengthens his determination. He becomes even more eager to learn their language so he can communicate with them properly and make sure they can eat enough food to grow healthy and strong. Although Lizzie has no idea what is going through his mind, she can clearly see the determination in his expression. Her fear gradually melts away, and before long she even begins wiping the sweat from his forehead. Eventually, they reach the mountaintop. Ju-won gratefully thanks the village chief for leading them there. After the chief leaves, Ju-won turns toward the cabin that will now become his home. The run-down building is in terrible shape, and seeing its condition makes him shiver as he realizes he'll probably have to spend another freezing night. Still grumbling about the cold, he steps inside the cabin, only to find Lizzie standing there with tears filling her eyes. He wants to ask what happened, but before he can react, Lizzie rushes past him, leaving him alone inside. After running for a while, Lizzie stops beside a nearby lake. There, the reason for her despair becomes clear. While they were gone, someone had broken into the cabin and stolen everything they owned. The crockery, the table, the bow, the hammer, the knife, and even their farming hoe had all disappeared. With nothing left, she can't even repair the damaged cabin. That means they'll have to sleep in the freezing cold without any protection from the wild animals that roam the mountain. As Lizzie sits there overwhelmed by hopelessness, Ju-won finally catches up to her. Relieved to have found her, he notices the tears running down her face. He quietly sits beside her and gently places his hand on top of her head in an attempt to comfort her. Even though Lizzie can't understand his words, she instinctively knows he is trying to reassure her. His kindness brings her some comfort, yet she still can't stop worrying about how they'll survive in such a cruel environment. Their cabin is falling apart, and her new husband doesn't seem like someone who has ever done hard manual work. Fortunately, repairing the cabin is something she believes she can handle herself. The real issue is food. To survive, they must hunt, yet Ju-won doesn't appear to have any experience using weapons. Even though her mind is filled with endless worries, her heart feels strangely calm whenever she's with him. Simply seeing Ju-won gives her a sense of relief, and somehow she believes he'll find a way to make everything better. Those emotions become too much for Lizzie to hold back, and tears once again begin streaming down her cheeks. Ju-won lets her cry for a while as he gently tells her that, back in his original world, he lost his parents when he was still very young. Even though life seemed completely hopeless, he somehow found the strength to keep moving forward. Looking back now, he's thankful that he never gave up because, if he had, he would have never met her. That is why he wants to make sure that both she and her daughter are protected and well cared for the rest of their lives. Lizzie can't understand the words he is saying, saying, but she can clearly feel the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in a long while, she completely lets down her guard. She wraps her arms around Ju-won and releases all the pain and emotions she has been holding inside for so long. However, when the little girl sees her mother crying, she immediately assumes that Ju-won has hurt her, just like her previous father used to. Determined to protect Lizzie, she rushes over and tries to pull her away from him. Instead, Ju-won gently pulls the little girl into the embrace as well. Ju-won still has no idea who the girl's real father is or what made Lizzie offer him food in the first place. But there is one thing he knows for certain. They are his family now. He silently promises himself that he will become the best husband and the best father he possibly can. He will give them the happiest life imaginable, so they never have to cry again. After the family finishes sharing their emotions, they return to the cabin. Once inside, an awkward silence fills the room. None of them know how to act after breaking down in front of one another. Eventually, Ju-won decides to break the silence by introducing himself. Since they don't understand Korean, he slowly pronounces each syllable of his name so they can repeat it. Fortunately, both Lizzie and the little girl are quick learners, and they manage to pronounce his name correctly almost immediately. After that, he points toward them, asking them to tell him their names as well. Lizzie goes first, carefully introducing herself and pronouncing her name. Ju-won compliments her beautiful name before turning to the little girl and asking her to introduce herself too. The little girl quietly lowers her head because her previous father never gave her a name. Lizzie never named her either, as life had already become far too difficult after that man died. Ju-won finds it heartbreaking that someone could grow up without even having a name, so he decides to give her one himself. After thinking through several possibilities, he eventually chooses Dorothy, inspired by one of his favorite childhood stories, The Wizard of Oz. The little girl instantly falls in love with the name and happily thanks Ju-won for giving her such a beautiful one. Seeing her smile fills him with happiness, and he silently hopes that one day she will live as happily as Dorothy did in the story he remembers. Later that evening, Ju-won stands outside the cabin, splitting logs to use as firewood for the fireplace throughout the night. A short distance away, Lizzie quietly watches him while reflecting on everything that has happened during the day. She softly whispers his name to herself. Even though it comes from a language she doesn't understand, it somehow sounds elegant to her. It makes her wonder who Ju-won truly is and where he originally came from. Ever since she was born, no man had ever treated her with kindness, not her father, and certainly not her husband. That is why Ju-won's gentle behavior is so difficult for her to understand. As Lizzie remains lost in her thoughts, Ju-won notices her standing by herself. He waves in her direction and even calls out her name. His voice pulls her back to reality, allowing her to get a proper look at him for the first time. She notices his black hair and dark eyes, reminding her of a legend she heard not long ago. According to that legend, a distant kingdom was caught in the middle of a war. As a last resort, they summoned a hero from another world. That legendary hero was also said to have black hair and black eyes. Still, she quickly dismisses the idea. There is no way a legendary hero would be living in such a rundown village, let alone serving as someone's slave. As she continues wondering about his identity, Ju-won has already walked over to her. Looking at him more closely, she realizes that his hair and eyes are actually closer to dark brown than pure black. He's probably just an ordinary man who happens to be a little taller than most people. That realization puts her heart at ease, although it also leaves her feeling strangely embarrassed. She can't even explain why her heart reacted the way it did. Ju-won finds her constantly changing expressions rather amusing, so he casually reaches over and gently pats her on the head. Lizzie melts beneath his touch, feeling a comforting warmth spread through her heart. The peaceful expression on her face makes her look even more adorable, drawing Ju-won toward her like a bee to a blooming flower. Before he even realizes what he's doing, he leans forward and softly plants a kiss on her lips. The unexpected kiss leaves Lizzie completely frozen. She never imagined that Ju-won would suddenly do something so intimate. Ju-won is just as shocked by his own actions. Overcome with embarrassment, he immediately turns around and runs away. As he walks deeper into the woods, he can't stop scolding himself. He can't believe he impulsively kissed Lizzie when they have only known each other for a single day. While trying to figure out how he is supposed to face her afterward, he suddenly realizes that he has wandered much deeper into the forest than he intended. He slowly scans the surroundings, searching for a path that leads back to the cabin. Then, without warning, he senses an overwhelming presence looming behind him. With a stiff expression, Ju-won slowly turns around and comes face to face with a terrifying wolf almost as large as he is. Fear instantly grips him. His heart begins to race as he struggles to decide whether he should run for his life or stand his ground and fight the massive beast. He firmly grips the stick lying on the ground and takes a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for the battle ahead. The wolf is just as determined to claim its prey. Without hesitation, it lunges straight at Ju-won, who has nothing but a wooden stick to defend himself. Ju-won quickly raises the stick between them, blocking the attack just in time. The wolf's sharp fangs sink into the wood, becoming lodged in the stick. Seizing the opportunity, Ju-won drives a powerful punch directly into the wolf's face. The blow only enrages the beast. With terrifying force, the wolf bites down so hard that the stick snaps cleanly in half. Now free once again, its deadly jaws are ready to strike. Ju-won realizes that staying on the defensive is no longer an option. He decides to attack first, but before his punch can connect, the wolf catches his arm in its jaws. Its razor-sharp teeth tear into his wrist, leaving behind a deep, gaping wound. Ju-won instinctively stumbles backward as an unbearable wave of pain shoots through his arm. It feels as though his entire arm has been set ablaze, but when he looks down at the injury, he freezes in shock. Actual flames are pouring out from his flesh. Ju-won stares in disbelief, wondering if the mysterious fire is some kind of magic. The incredible sight instantly fills him with confidence. Even the wolf appears intimidated, hesitating as it stares at the burning flames. The wolf tries to retreat, but Ju-won refuses to let it escape. He rushes forward and begins hammering the beast with his flaming fist. Blow after blow crashes into the wolf as its agonized howls echo through the forest. Yet Ju-won shows no mercy. He keeps striking until the creature finally collapses, falling completely silent. Only after the fight is over does Ju-won drop to the ground, exhausted, desperately trying to catch his breath and recover what little strength he has left. As he rests, his eyes drift toward the arm that had been engulfed in flames only moments earlier. He carefully examines it, expecting to find burns or the massive wound left by the wolf's bite. To his astonishment, there isn't a single mark anywhere on his skin. This leaves him wondering if he somehow managed to use magic without any training or guidance. The thought immediately reminds him of the fantasy novels he used to read during his free time. Curious, he begins experimenting by shouting the names of various spells. Fireball. Nothing happens. Firestorm. Still nothing. Firewall. Again, no response. Refusing to give up, he even recites a magical incantation he remembers from those novels, but that proves just as useless. Eventually, Juan lets out a defeated sigh and gives up. There has to be some hidden trick to using magic at will. Even so, he is completely certain that he possesses magical abilities. After all, the arm that should have been left with a horrifying, gaping wound has already healed without leaving even the slightest scar. Determination burns within him. Ju-won vows to learn how to control his magic as quickly as possible. Doing so will not only make him a stronger hunter, but also allow him to heal his family whenever they are injured, especially since there isn't a single doctor anywhere on this mountain. He clenches his fists tightly and silently promises himself that he will become stronger, better, and more capable. He wants to protect his family and give them a life far better than the one they have now. More than anything, he never wants to be called a curse again. He never wants to be seen as someone who brings death wherever he goes. Painful memories begin resurfacing. After his parents died, his grandfather was the only person willing to take him in because none of his other relatives wanted the burden of raising him. But not long after that, his grandfather also passed away. From that day onward, all of his cousins blamed Ju-won. They beat him mercilessly, convinced that he was an evil child cursed to bring death upon anyone who cared for him. Ju-won forcefully pushes those memories to the back of his mind. Now isn't the time to dwell on the past. He has more important things to do. The wolf's blood could easily attract other dangerous predators. Wasting no time, he hoists the heavy carcass onto his shoulders and begins carrying it back toward the mountain cabin, planning to butcher it and turn it into meat for his family. Back at the cabin, Lizzie and Dorothy are preparing dinner when they suddenly notice a wolf's head staring through the window. The terrifying sight instantly makes Dorothy burst into tears. Hearing her cries, Lizzie immediately grabs a knife and positions herself in front of Dorothy, ready to protect her from whatever is outside. Nervously, she peers through the window. A wave of relief washes over her. It isn't a living wolf. It's Ju-won carrying the dead wolf over his shoulders. However, the relief doesn't last long. The moment she notices the cuts and bruises covering his face, she rushes outside to check on him. It doesn't take long for Lizzie to realize that Ju-won must have gone through an incredibly dangerous battle. Otherwise, he would never have returned looking so badly injured. Ju-won gently tries to reassure her, explaining that there are only a few minor scratches and that everything is alright now. Although Lizzie can't understand a single word he says, she can tell from his expression and gentle tone that he's trying to tell her not to worry. Without thinking, she suddenly throws her arms around him in a tight embrace. The unexpected hug catches Ju-won completely by surprise. He never imagined that Lizzie would be the one to take the initiative. Dorothy quickly joins in as well, wrapping her little arms around his knees, while trying to tell him how frightened she had been. Despite neither of them being able to understand the other's language, even without words, Ju-won can clearly feel how worried they were. That realization fills him with guilt. He had promised himself that he would never make them cry, yet not even a single day has passed, and he has already broken that promise. The following morning, after everyone has finally calmed down, Ju-won begins processing the wolf. He carefully skins its hide before separating the meat from the bones. When he was younger, he often watched his grandfather, who enjoyed raising animals and occasionally butchered them during special occasions. Although Ju-won remembers the basic techniques, he quickly realizes that butchering an animal is far more difficult than his grandfather ever made it seem. Still, no matter how difficult it is, he has to finish the job for the sake of his family. Just as he is about to continue working, Lizzie walks into the barn carrying a basket. She quietly hands it to him so he has somewhere to place all the freshly cut meat. Ju-wan smiles gratefully and tries to thank her, but his pronunciation of the local language comes out clumsy and awkward. Seeing him struggle, Lizzie gently repeats the word and helps him pronounce it correctly. For the first time in her life, someone has sincerely thanked her. This also makes Lizzie realize that she has shared so many first-time experiences with Ju-wan, whether it was hearing her first heartfelt "thank you" or even sharing her very first kiss. However, it also makes her wonder if she was Ju-wan's first kiss as well, or if another woman had already stolen that precious moment from him. As a woman, she can't help but feel jealous of whoever might have been the one to receive Ju-wan's first kiss. The thought leaves her feeling slightly down, and before she realizes it, her heart begins drifting toward thoughts she shouldn't be having. Still, Lizzie quickly snaps herself back to reality since there is still work to be done. She moves over to help Ju-wan place all the meat into the bucket, but he refuses to let her handle any of the dirty work. That only leaves Lizzie even more puzzled because, in her eyes, those kinds of chores are supposed to be a woman's responsibility. Yet Ju-wan carries them out so naturally, as if it has always been his job. A moment later, Ju-wan slowly walks over and leans toward her face. Lizzie's heart immediately begins pounding as she wonders if he is about to kiss her lips once again. She instinctively closes her eyes in anticipation, only for Ju-wan to gently place a kiss on her forehead instead. Realizing she had been expecting something much bolder makes her feel incredibly embarrassed. Ju-wan her reaction and leans toward her once more. This time, however, Lizzie stubbornly keeps her eyes wide open, refusing to fall for the same trick twice. But unlike before, Ju-wan never intended to tease her. Instead, he closes the distance and gently kisses her on the lips, catching Lizzie completely off guard since she never expected him to do it so suddenly. Already blushing from embarrassment, Lizzie's gaze suddenly shifts toward Dorothy as she wonders if the little girl witnessed everything. Unable to bear the embarrassment any longer, she turns around and dashes out of the barn like a Looney Tunes character. With Lizzie gone, Dorothy feels like she should help Ju-wan instead. Although her tiny little hands don't accomplish much, Ju-wan still sincerely thanks her for trying, making the young girl beam with happiness. Ju-wan picks up the bucket filled with meat and carries it into the main cabin. As soon as he steps inside, a terrible rotting smell fills his nose. He can't understand why Lizzie is drying the animal hide inside the house. However, after watching her carefully scrape and cure the skin, he realizes that the hide must be an incredibly valuable resource to her. It makes Ju-wan realize just how little he truly understands about this world's way of life. Back in his previous life, many things people considered ordinary are treated like precious treasures here. Because of that, he understands that he must not only change his way of thinking, but also learn how trading and money work in this world. Without even basic financial knowledge, he knows it will only be a matter of time before someone clever takes advantage of him. While Lizzie remains occupied with curing the meat, Ju-wan decides to head back into the forest to get a little more work done. Lizzie immediately tries to stop him, worried that he might end up getting hurt again. Ju-wan reassures her that this time he only plans on chopping down a few trees, so there is nothing to worry about. After entering the woods, Ju-wan spots a relatively small tree and decides it will make good practice. Ideally, he would have preferred finding an oak tree, since he had heard it produces the best firewood. Unfortunately, he has no idea how to tell one type of tree from another, leaving him no choice but to work with whatever stands before him. After marking the spot where he wants to cut, Ju-wan firmly grips the axe and swings it toward the tree. Unfortunately, his grip is still too weak, causing the axe to slip right out of his hands. Feeling embarrassed, he quickly looks around to make sure nobody witnessed the mistake. Several hours later, Ju-wan finally returns carrying a sack packed full of chopped logs. Although he had promised Lizzie that he wouldn't get hurt again, using an axe proves much harder than he expected, and he ends up suffering several minor injuries during the process. Seeing his condition, Lizzie immediately rushes over to treat his wounds. Dorothy also wants to help just like Lizzie does, so she scoops up some water from the jar and splashes it onto Ju-wan in an attempt to cool him off. Although she ends up making quite a mess, Ju-wan still appreciates her good intentions and gently pats her on the head. Once Lizzie finishes treating his injuries, the three of them gather around the dinner table. Lizzie serves the wolf meat Ju-wan hunted the previous day. After going so long without eating meat, the family happily enjoys the meal, especially Dorothy, who stuffs herself so much that she immediately falls into a food coma. Ju-wan gently picks up the sleeping Dorothy and carries her over to the bed so she can sleep comfortably without getting cold. Meanwhile, Lizzie heats a pot of water for Ju-wan so he can finally wash away all the dirt, sweat, and grime covering his body. In this world, which is still in its medieval era, a wife is expected to personally clean her husband using a washcloth. Lizzie gently wipes Ju-wan's body, while he clearly enjoys the feeling of being cared for by her. However, Lizzie feels incredibly embarrassed as as his well-defined muscles constantly distract her. Ju-won can't resist teasing her a little. He reaches out, takes her hand, and leans in for a kiss. That unexpected kiss soon blossoms into an intimate moment, and neither of the newlyweds can hold back their feelings any longer. The rest is history. It was the very first time Lizzie had ever slept so peacefully. Even during her childhood, every single night had been filled with trauma. Her family was extremely poor, forcing everyone to sleep together in the same room. Because of this, her parents had no privacy, which only frustrated her father even more. He would often abuse her mother right in front of Lizzie and her siblings. Every morning, they would wake up to see their mother covered in bruises while quietly crying to herself. Night after night, Lizzie feared for her own future, wondering if she would someday suffer the same fate as her mother. Thankfully, fate had something different in store for her. She met Ju-won, a man who treated her like a queen and her daughter like a princess. Each morning, she awakens to the comforting crackle of burning logs that keep their home warm throughout the night. Every day, she hopes to open her eyes while resting in the embrace of the kind-hearted man beside her. Lizzie understands that not every married couple shares nights this gentle and loving, which is why she treasures every moment of happiness that Ju-won has given her. Later that morning, while everyone else is still asleep, Lizzie quietly climbs out of bed and begins taking care of the usual household chores. Although she hates leaving Ju-won's warm embrace, she still feels obligated to fulfill her wifely duties, believing it is the only way she can repay him for everything he has done for her and Dorothy. Despite Lizzie's traditional way of thinking, Ju-won is still a man from the modern world. Instead of letting her work alone, he also gets out of bed and helps extinguish the fire before assisting with the other simple chores around the house. While working together, he continues practicing the small amount of the local language he has managed to learn. One of the words he has picked up is oni, which instantly makes Lizzie blush with embarrassment since she is still not accustomed to receiving so much affection. Seeing her reaction only encourages Ju-won to tease her even more. As he enjoys watching her cherry red cheeks become even redder, while the couple continue flirting with one another, Dorothy finally wakes up. It isn't because their conversation disturbed her sleep, but because she spent the entire night dreaming about eating meat. She worries that if she sleeps in too long, the precious meat might somehow disappear. Thankfully, when she peeks inside the bucket and discovers that every piece is still there, she immediately breathes a sigh of relief and eagerly looks forward to breakfast. Watching the little girl become so excited over something as simple as meat fills Ju-won with even greater determination to hunt more animals in the forest. He doesn't care whether he has to face wolves, lions, or any other dangerous beast. His only wish is to make sure his family never has to go without meat again. For that reason, he decides to bring an axe with him this time, believing it to be a far more reliable weapon than the ordinary stick he had picked up from the ground before. Holding the axe firmly in his hands, Ju-won ventures deep into the forest. Before long, he senses an overwhelming presence that feels even more terrifying and suffocating than the monstrous wolf he hunted the previous day. The oppressive aura causes Ju-won to tighten his grip on the axe as he patiently waits for the creature to reveal itself. However, instead of a savage beast emerging from the shadows, a hooded man slowly steps into view. Sometime earlier, the hooded man was wandering through the forest as he normally did when he noticed a patch of blood that appeared to belong to a large beast, most likely a wolf. The sight immediately caught the old man's attention, making him wonder which group from the village had ventured into the mountains to hunt such a dangerous creature. Curious to uncover the truth, he decided to track down whoever was responsible. However, after secretly observing the mountain for several days, the only person he found was Ju-won, a man with an enormous build and powerful muscles. At first, the hooded man suspected that Ju-won might have been the one who killed the wolf, but after watching him for a while, he realized Ju-won couldn't even swing an axe properly. That only made the situation even more confusing. In the end, he decided that the best way to find out the truth was to confront Ju-won himself. When the two finally met face to face, the old man immediately spotted the wolf bite mark on Ju-won's forearm. He found it unbelievable that such a severe wound had healed so quickly. Under normal circumstances, an ordinary villager would likely die from an infection within just a few days, especially since there were no doctors living anywhere on the mountain. Yet Ju-won now stood before him completely unharmed, without the slightest trace of injury left on his body. There was only one explanation. Ju-won had to be a mage, and an exceptionally powerful one at that. The realization filled the old man with excitement after he had nearly abandoned all hope of ever getting his revenge. Now that he had discovered someone as gifted as Ju-won, he believed that if he handled things carefully, he might finally have the chance to accomplish the revenge he had dreamed of for so many years. Although the hooded man appeared to be nothing more than a frail old man now, things had been very different in his younger days. Back when he was still healthy and full of strength, he had chosen to become the mountain caretaker for a noble's territory. It was a position that carried great opportunity. If war ever broke out, he would be summoned to fight as one of the noble's soldiers. By earning enough military achievements, he could even receive official status from the noble, allowing him to rise from an ordinary commoner into one of the elite. That was how he first arrived at this mountain, beneath which lay a peaceful village blessed with abundant resources. However, the village had one serious serious problem. The villagers had to venture deep into the forest whenever they needed to gather firewood. The forest itself was a terrifying place, and many who entered it never managed to return alive. As the mountain caretaker, the hooded man also had to enter the dense forest to collect wood. Unfortunately, one day he wandered much farther than he should have and suffered devastating injuries, including a broken leg. Since a mountain caretaker needed every one of his limbs to perform his duties, his dream career was effectively over. Already overwhelmed with despair, he encountered something even worse. He stumbled upon a group of goblins, a race of monsters known for abducting human women and forcing them to bear their children. Somehow, the hooded man barely escaped with his life. However, because of the injuries he had sustained, he was forced into retirement and spent the next 20 years living quietly in the village. Yet throughout those 20 years, there was never a single day when he stopped hating the goblins. He waited patiently for an opportunity to take revenge against them, and that opportunity finally appeared when he crossed paths with Ju-won. Meeting Ju-won gave the old man hope once again. Not only did Ju-won possess an incredibly strong physique, but he also had astonishing regenerative abilities. On top of that, the hooded man was convinced that Ju-won was a magician. Because of this, he resolved to dedicate the rest of his life to teaching Ju-won everything necessary to become the strongest hunter possible. As time passed, the hooded man continued watching Ju-won from a distance. At the same time, Ju-won kept a close eye on the old man as well, remaining cautious in case he suddenly attempted something suspicious. Then one day, the old man unexpectedly told Ju-won that he wanted to accept him as his student and pass down everything he knew. Hearing those words left Ju-won completely stunned, as he had no idea what the old man truly meant. The following morning, Ju-won finished eating breakfast and prepared himself for training. This time, however, he wasn't heading into the forest alone. The hooded man would accompany him as his teacher, guiding him toward becoming a skilled professional hunter. Although Ju-won had agreed to receive his guidance, he still didn't trust the mysterious old man. Something about him felt incredibly shady, reminding Ju-won of his greedy manager back on Earth. Because of that, he chose to keep the old man away from his family and simply had him wait outside the house. Once Ju-won was ready to leave, Lizzie packed him a lunch, knowing he would likely spend the entire day training. After gathering everything he needed, Ju-won said goodbye to both Lizzie and Dorothy before setting off, while the two warmly saw him off. For most people, this kind of farewell would probably feel completely ordinary. However, Ju-won still couldn't get used to it. He felt unbelievably fortunate to have such a loving and beautiful family waiting for him at home. That was exactly why he had to continue training and become even stronger to protect the precious life he had finally found. The hooded man had no idea what motivated Ju-won so deeply, but he was pleased to see his enthusiasm for learning. At the same time, he deliberately kept the truth about the goblins hidden. He intended to wait until their contract had been completed. Once that agreement was in place, Ju-won would no longer be able to back out, even if the mere mention of goblins filled him with fear. Leading the way, the hooded man guided Ju-won deep into the forest. There, he instructed him to carefully imitate every step he took. Ju-won paid close attention as the old man moved through the woods in an unpredictable manner, leaving behind no obvious rhythm or pattern that anyone could easily follow. Ju-won carefully follows the old man's footsteps, wondering if this was the kind of footwork he had once read about in those Murray martial arts comics. The old man simply smiles as he watches Ju-won clumsily imitate each movement, trying his best to master the unusual stepping pattern. Once Ju-won learns how to leave behind a misleading trail, the hooded man continues teaching him many other survival techniques needed to live in the forest. He shows him how to distinguish different kinds of trees by feeling their bark and observing their appearance. He also teaches him how to mentally map the forest, ensuring he can always find his way out if he ever gets lost. The two continue their training until they eventually reach a cliff. There, the old man allows Ju-won to take a brief rest so he can catch his breath and have a quick snack to restore his energy. Ju-won is delighted to finally relax and enjoy the lunch Lizzie had lovingly prepared for him that morning. Inside the lunchbox are a fried egg and several pieces of steak, making it the perfect meal after such exhausting training. However, just as he is about to take his first bite, the old man immediately tells him to close the lunchbox. He explains that the unnatural smell of cooked food could attract nearby wild animals. The order breaks Ju-won's heart, because he had been looking forward to eating the meal his wife packed for him. Still, rules are rules. The old man tells him to stand up once more since they still have quite a long journey ahead. Before long, they finally arrive at their destination, a small wooden hut built high on the mountain. It turns out to be the old man's home. He steps inside, returns carrying a massive bow, and hands it over to Ju-won. Ju-won has never seen a bow shaped like this before. Looking at how stiff it is, he wonders how anyone could possibly pull back its string. The old man quickly proves him wrong by effortlessly drawing the bow before releasing an arrow that slams into a nearby tree with enough force to nearly pierce straight through it. The incredible display leaves Ju-won completely stunned. He never imagined the old man possessed such tremendous strength. Without wasting any time, the old man tells Ju-won to pick up the bow and fire an arrow the same way he just did. Since Ju-won has never used such a bow before, he struggles to maintain the proper posture while aiming. The old man patiently corrects every mistake, personally adjusting his stance and posture whenever necessary. With each correction, Ju-won gradually understands another piece of proper archery technique, allowing his skills to improve step by step. Despite having no previous experience in archery, Ju-won begins to show remarkable progress in a surprisingly short amount of time. Meanwhile, as Ju-won continues training with the hooded man, Dorothy suddenly wakes from a nightmare about her painful childhood. She is terrified that Lizzie and Ju-won might abandon her one day, just like her previous mother and father did. The moment she opens her eyes, she hurriedly searches for Lizzie but cannot find her anywhere. Her fear immediately returns, making her believe they may have truly left her behind. Panicking, she rushes to check the bucket of meat, only to find that it is still there. That sight eases her anxiety slightly, but she remains worried about Lizzie's whereabouts. As she continues searching, she suddenly hears loud voices coming from outside. Carefully peeking through the window, Dorothy sees Lizzie being harassed by 3 men from the village. She immediately recognizes them. Fear grips Dorothy, as she worries the men might begin beating Lizzie as well. Although she desperately wants to help, she is simply too frightened to step in. Outside, Lizzie repeatedly explains that she has stolen nothing and that every bit of food was personally hunted by her husband. However, the 3 men refuse to believe her. Instead, they accuse her of being an evil witch who caused her previous husband's death. Now that she has married another man, they claim she is trying to get him killed as well by stealing food that belongs to others. No matter how hard Lizzie pleads, the men shove her aside before forcing their way into the house to search for evidence themselves. Inside, they discover the wolf's hide, and their eyes immediately light up since they know it could fetch a high price. They also notice the large amount of cured meat stored in the bucket, causing them to question whether that slave had truly hunted an entire wolf on his own. The men prepare to carry everything away, but Lizzie quickly blocks their path and firmly declares that she will never allow them to steal her husband's hard-earned possessions. The 3 men grow even more enraged, mocking her for remaining silent all those years when she had no husband. Yet now that she has found a new man, they ridicule her, claiming she has suddenly found the courage to stand up to them. Without the slightest bit of mercy, one of them strikes her hard, sending her crashing to the ground before ordering the other 2 to gather everything valuable from the cabin and get ready to leave. Lend hits the floor and instinctively tries to push herself back up, but her eyes immediately fall on Dorothy hiding beneath the bed. She realizes that if she stays down any longer, the men may discover Dorothy's hiding place and harm her as well. Caught between protecting herself and protecting the little girl, she desperately struggles to decide what to do. At that moment, the red-haired man asks the blonde man what would happen if the mountain keeper ever discovered what they had done to his wife. Unwilling to risk offending someone as mysterious as the mountain keeper, the blonde man decides the safest solution is to silence her forever before burning the cabin to the ground, ensuring that no one would ever uncover the truth. The other 2 men grin after hearing the plan, realizing they had worried for nothing. After all, the mountain keeper doesn't even understand their language, so there is no possible way he could learn what truly happened from his wife once they are finished with her. Hidden beneath the bed, Dorothy can only watch helplessly as the cruel men drag her mother away. The moment they disappear from sight, she crawls out of her hiding place and desperately cries out Ju-won's name, praying that he will hear her voice and return in time to save Lizzie. Meanwhile, Ju-won has just finished his training and is preparing to head home. Just as he is about to leave, the sound of someone crying echoes through the distance. His heart immediately sinks with worry, fearing that something terrible may have happened to Dorothy or Lizzie. He wastes no time and sprints toward his home as fast as he can. As he races back, he suddenly comes across the 3 men forcefully dragging Lizzie away. The sight instantly shatters his composure, and he charges at them like a wild beast. His first punch crashes into the red-haired man's face, knocking him unconscious with a single blow. Without slowing down, he turns to the fat man and drives his knee straight into the man's face, crushing his nose. The blonde man is the quickest to recover from the shock. He immediately throws a punch from Ju-won's side, hoping to catch him off guard, but Ju-won effortlessly slips past the attack, grabs hold of him, and hurls him violently onto the ground. Before the man has a chance to recover, Ju-won slams a powerful punch into his face. Only after delivering the blow does he suddenly realize that he has been fighting like a savage animal. Seeing Ju-won hesitate, the blonde man mistakes it for weakness. He quickly grabs a nearby scythe and swings it toward Ju-won while his attention is elsewhere. Fortunately, Ju-won reacts at the very last moment, catching the man's arm before the blade can reach his neck. Filled with rage, he prepares to snap the man's arm in half. Just as he is about to do it, the old man steps in and quietly reminds him that his daughter is watching everything unfold and is terrified beyond words. Those few words shake Ju-won more deeply than facing the wolf ever had. In an instant, the rage inside him disappears, replaced by overwhelming fear. He slowly turns toward Lizzie, expecting to see nothing but fear in her eyes. Only moments ago, his own eyes had been consumed by madness, but now they tremble as though he is on the verge of tears. Lizzie cannot honestly tell him that she wasn't frightened. Watching him brutally beat those men in such a feral state reminded her of her previous husband, who used to lose control in exactly the same way. For a brief moment, she couldn't help but wonder whether Ju-won might one day turn that same violence against her. But as she looks into his eyes, she no longer sees rage. Instead, she sees nothing but genuine concern for her and the family they share. That single look reassures her completely. She realizes that no matter what happens, Ju-won will always stand between them and danger, and that the fear she felt moments ago had been unfounded. With that realization, Lizzie gently takes Ju-won's hand and presses it against her cheek, wanting to feel the warmth within him. In that simple touch, she feels nothing but kindness. Returning that same warmth, she softly thanks him for protecting her and her family from the cruelty and evil of the world. Ju-won pulls Lizzie into a warm embrace, and she happily wraps her arms around him in return. As the couple enjoys their heartfelt moment together, their eyes suddenly land on Dorothy, reminding them that they had completely forgotten about their daughter. Immediately setting their romance aside, they hurry over to check on her, only to find that she is still trembling from everything that had just happened. The brutal scene had reopened the painful memories of her deadbeat father, who used to abuse both her and her mother. When Dorothy witnessed the three cruel men attacking Lizzie, she became terrified that they would hurt her as well. That fear was the reason she stayed hidden beneath the bed instead of coming out to help. Even so, Dorothy worries that Lizzie might hate her or even abandon her for not doing anything. Filled with guilt, she apologizes for hiding while Lizzie was being beaten. Hearing those words shatters Lizzie's heart, and she immediately pulls Dorothy into a tight embrace. Holding her close, she gently assures Dorothy that she did absolutely nothing wrong. Instead, Lizzie praises her for thinking quickly and hiding herself before the dangerous men could find her. Dorothy gradually calms down after hearing those comforting words, although she still seems frightened whenever she looks at Ju-won. Seeing this, Lizzie softly reassures her, telling Dorothy that there is nothing left to fear because her dad will always protect her. Dorothy tilts her head in confusion before reminding Lizzie that her father died in the mountains. So how can he protect me? Lizzie can't help but giggle at Dorothy's innocent misunderstanding. She explains that she isn't talking about Dorothy's abusive father but about Ju-won instead. Dorothy still doesn't understand how Ju-won could possibly be her father. Lizzie then explains that since she has become Dorothy's stepmother, Ju-won, as her husband, is naturally Dorothy's stepfather. The explanation instantly fills Dorothy with excitement. She can hardly believe that Ju-won is now her new father. To Dorothy, Ju-won is the greatest man in the world. He is tall, powerful, and incredibly kind. She never imagined that after losing her cruel and worthless father, she would be blessed with such a handsome and caring one instead. Without another thought, Dorothy dashes out of her room and runs straight toward him, happily calling him Daddy. Although Ju-won doesn't understand the exact words she is saying, he can tell it means something close to father. Smiling warmly, he allows Dorothy to crash into him as she hugs him tightly, refusing to let go. Ju-won's heart melts with happiness. Like any loving father would, he reaches down to pick her up. However, just before lifting her, he notices an unusual smell. It doesn't take him long to realize that Dorothy had probably wet herself out of fear during everything that happened. Even so, he has no intention of ruining such a precious moment. Without saying a word, he lifts her into his arms anyway and lets her cling to him as long as she wants. Lizzie soon joins them, and for a brief moment, the three of them enjoy the warmth and peace of being together as a family. That peaceful moment doesn't last long, however, as Dorothy suddenly notices the robbers and the bucket of meat they had stolen. Instantly forgetting everything else, she sprints toward the bucket as fast as a cheetah. She hurriedly removes the lid to check whether all of the meat is still inside. The moment she confirms that nothing is missing, her gloomy expression disappears, and she becomes as cheerful as ever. Watching from a distance, Ju-won and Lizzie can't help laughing at Dorothy's adorable behavior. They quickly realize that her love for meat is stronger than almost anything else. Seeing how happy it makes her only strengthens Ju-won's determination. He becomes even more eager to hunt more animals so Dorothy can enjoy eating meat every single day, no matter what it takes. Before that, however, he still has unfinished business with the three robbers. Ju-won asks Lizzie to take Dorothy safely inside while he walks alone toward the unconscious men. Just as he is about to deal with them, the old hunter suddenly stops him and advises him not to kill or further injure the three robbers. Those words immediately cool the burning rage inside Ju-won. He realizes that attacking them again could easily lead to his arrest, or even worse, send him back into slavery. Grateful for the old hunter's wisdom, Ju-won thanks him for the advice. The old hunter suggests leaving the three men where they are and simply taking their tools instead. Agreeing with his suggestion, Ju-won collects the robbers' tools and carries them back home. Before leaving, he gives the unconscious men one final warning that if they ever dare cross his path again, he will make sure they suffer a fate far worse than death. Later that night, once the entire commotion had finally settled down, Ju-won takes care of Lizzie's bruises by attempting to heal them with his healing magic. Ever since his battle against the wolf, he hasn't been able to reproduce that same miracle, so he isn't very confident that his magic will work this time. To his surprise, every bruise on Lizzie's face fades away completely within just a few seconds. Delighted by his successful healing, Ju-won embraces Lizzie and carries her to the bedroom, where the couple spends the entire night enjoying each other's company. By the following morning, the village is as lively as ever as everyone busily prepares for the the approaching harvest festival. While the villagers go about their work, the village chief's wife is angrily scolding her husband for giving away all the fabric she had spent the last 10 years. The village chief patiently tries to calm her by explaining that the village desperately needs a mountain guardian, and in his eyes, there is no one better suited for that role than Ju-won. Even so, his wife remains bitter because that precious fabric had taken her a full decade to gather. The village chief reassures her that it is a worthwhile investment since Ju-won is not only an excellent fighter, but also a skilled hunter. He then tells his wife that she should build a good relationship with Lizzie because if Ju-won starts hunting rabbits regularly, Lizzie might be willing to sell them rabbit pelts at a very affordable price. Hearing this, the village chief's wife finally begins to calm down and decides to place her trust in her husband's judgment. Once she leaves, however, the village chief's gentle smile slowly changes into a sly smirk because he never revealed the real reason he was so generous with the fabric. The truth is that he had noticed the wolf bite on Ju-won's arm, a wound that should have left him gravely injured. Yet Ju-won looked perfectly healthy, and the injury appeared to have healed without leaving any trace behind. The village chief knows that only healing magic is capable of restoring such a serious wound in such a short amount of time. That can only mean Ju-won is a healing mage, especially since there isn't another person capable of casting healing magic anywhere in the entire county, let alone within this small village. That realization awakens the greed hidden deep inside the village chief's heart. He begins to think that if he were to sell Ju-won to a wealthy noble, he could finally escape this miserable village and enjoy a luxurious life in a grand city. That is also why he kept this discovery hidden even from his own wife. He feared that she might accidentally spread the information to the other villagers. At this point, only he and the old hunter, Gus, know about Ju-won's healing abilities. Meanwhile, back on the mountain, Ju-won remains completely unaware of the schemes being plotted by both the village chief and the hunter Gus. Instead, he is far too busy admiring his adorable rabbit-like wife. Ever since the village chief visited their home and gifted them the fabric, Lizzie has been as joyful as a rabbit discovering an entire carrot field. Ju-won has no idea what she plans to make with all that fabric, so he simply lets her enjoy herself while he leaves the house to continue training with the old man, Gus. Yesterday, Gus told him that they would be hunting rabbits today, and that thought makes Ju-won feel uneasy. He simply can't bring himself to hunt such adorable creatures because they remind him too much of both his wife and his daughter. Because of that, he secretly hopes that the rabbits living in this forest are ugly enough that he won't feel guilty when it comes time to shoot them. Sometime later, the young hunter returns to the front of his residence and lets out a sigh of fatigue after finishing his chores. He notes that he has already fetched water and chopped all the firewood for the day, but realizes he still has a good amount of free time left. The young man decides to take advantage of that moment of tranquility to practice a bit more magic and test his limits. He notices that healing injuries has become very easy, but complains that he still can't generate even a small spark of fire. Ju-won becomes thoughtful and tries to understand the reason why his fire magic worked perfectly in that previous situation. Quite intrigued, he wonders if the magic only manifested that time because it was an extreme emergency. The youth closes his eyes and concentrates deeply, making the energy circulate through the center of his body. He extends his arm firmly and shouts the name of his fire spell, hoping something incredible will happen from his hand. Nothing happens, but he doesn't get discouraged and simply regrets that little Dorothy would love to see a bit of magical pyrotechnics. The hunter knows his healing magic doesn't make cool, bright sound effects. That's why the little girl doesn't care much for it. He silently regrets not being able to show even a small flame to impress and cheer up his little daughter. Suddenly, sparks of heat begin to rise from the tip of his fingers, leaving him completely shocked and jaw-dropped. A small flame lights up on his index finger, but he jokes that it looks more like the flame of a common lighter. At that moment, Dorothy comes out of the cabin yawning and rubbing her sleepy eyes, calling her new father's attention in the yard. She tries to clear her blurred vision to see what Ju-won is doing that is so interesting outside in the daylight. The little girl widens her golden eyes in absolute amazement when she focuses on the raised hand of the gigantic hunter. She points, marveling at his finger, and enthusiastically shouts that her father's hand is really producing fire. Ju-won warns her not to get too close so she doesn't get burned, but the girl already wants to run and tell the news to her mother. Dorothy remains completely dazzled as she watches the small flame dancing in the air right before her innocent and joyful face. Hearing her daughter's excited shouts, Lizzie comes running out of the cabin and quickly approaches the two in the garden. The young bride brings her hand to her mouth in surprise upon seeing the fire emanating from her gigantic husband's hand. While the two admire the scene, Ju-won tries to increase the flame to make them even happier, but realizes it is very difficult. Ju-won celebrates being able to use both types of magic, but Lizzie suddenly lets out a surprised shout after remembering an urgent task. The hunter becomes confused as he watches her hurriedly run away with Dorothy before giving him time to finish the demonstration. The young woman rushes into the cabin to check the pots, followed closely by the small and curious Dorothy. Left alone in the middle of the lawn, the protagonist humorously regrets that he pushed himself quite a bit just to light that little flame. He looks at the tiny flame burning tingling on his finger and realizes, with a drop of sweat on his forehead, that he now doesn't know how to turn it off. Not knowing what else to do, he simply gives up and decides to keep his finger lit until the fire goes out on its own. Suddenly, a crackling noise echoes, and the flame on his finger dissolves into small golden sparks, startling the young man. Walking through the forest, he concludes that the magic of this world is bizarre, and that he still hasn't managed to understand how it works. The young hunter opens the wooden door and enters once again into the safety and cozy warmth of his beloved cabin. He spots little Dorothy standing beside the massive wooden bucket and gently calls out to her to see what's wrong. The little girl turns around with a sad pout and complains, discouraged, that the amount of meat in the bucket has decreased quite a bit. Lizzie lets out a small laugh in the background while Ju-won realizes that Dorothy's only sadness comes from seeing her beloved meat supply dwindling. Moved by her pout, the hunter puts on a determined expression and silently promises himself that he will bring home fresh rabbit meat today. Suddenly, Old Man appears at the door and asks if Ju-won is already ready to go. Giving the young man a slight start, Ju-won realizes that his hunting master has already arrived and greets him warmly to begin the day's work. He quickly grabs his hunting gear and tells the two that he is leaving for the hunt. Dorothy runs over to say goodbye and wishes her daddy safe travels, and he thanks her with a smile for her affection. He gently pats his daughter's little head and praises her, making the little one happily nod with blushing cheeks. Lizzie affectionately asks him to be careful in the woods, and Ju-won replies that she must also take care of herself at home. The hunter gives his wife a sweet goodbye kiss, leaving little Dorothy completely surprised by the scene. Feeling jealous and making an adorable pout, the little girl asks for a goodbye kiss too. Laughing at the situation, Ju-won bends down affectionately. He plants a loud kiss on Dorothy's cheek, causing her to wear a huge, radiant smile filled with happiness. Ju-won notices the smell of meat on her breath and asks if she has been secretly eating some, and the little girl happily admits it with a smile. Leaving the cabin, the two hunters walk directly toward the place where the experienced old man had set his traps. Along the way, the elderly man continues giving several valuable lessons, pointing at different trees and explaining which ones are suitable for firewood. At times, he makes Ju-won stop to examine rabbit droppings on the ground and identify how close the prey is. Suddenly, the old master extends his hand and quietly orders Ju-won to stop immediately where he is. With great caution, the elderly man points toward a nearby bush, indicating where the target is hiding. The youth widens his eyes in complete surprise. He discovers a massive, muscular beast with long ears. Realizing it doesn't look like a normal rabbit, he thinks the creature resembles an evolved, bizarre kangaroo more than the cute animals he knew back on Earth. Noticing their presence, the beast growls aggressively and bares its sharp teeth. Without showing any fear, the master comments that the creature still has plenty of energy because it was caught only a short while ago, making it perfect for a first hunt. Old Man warns that it won't be easy at all because taking down a beast that fights back requires great courage and composure from a hunter. He explains that facing a wild animal that resists leaves an unforgettable mark on the mind of anyone hunting for the first time. The elderly man orders Ju-won to take out the special arrow he had given him, and the young hunter seriously nods in preparation. The master praises Ju-won's intelligence for already managing to understand the local language in such a short time since arriving there. With an encouraging look, Old Man entrusts the responsibility to the young man and solemnly tells him that this first hunt belongs to him. The experienced hunter promises to teach him about the true cruelty of hunting and guarantees that he will never forget that day. The veteran quietly orders him to take a few more careful steps closer to the monster. Old Man tells him to aim at its leg first, and Ju-won is surprised to realize that this serves as training against a live target. He positions himself to shoot, knowing that he must first hit the creature while it is standing still, and then aim again while it thrashes in pain. The old man teaches that the forest is fair and favors no one. He warns that acting with needless cruelty will one day bring serious consequences. The elderly man reminds him that, to survive and return home alive, he must never forget today's lesson while Ju-won pulls back the bowstring. Ju-won hesitates for a moment while aiming at the beast's leg, knowing that the shot won't kill the animal, but will only cause unnecessary pain. Growing impatient with the delay, Old Man firmly orders him to shoot the beast's leg first and then aim directly at its head. The wild monster displays a terrifying expression and begins to drool with hatred, growling in the direction of the two hunters deep within the forest. As he looks at the trapped beast, the young man suddenly recalls the desperation he felt when he first woke up in this world. Painful images of his former body, extremely thin and weak, locked inside a metal cage, begin flooding his mind. He remembers with horror the bodies rotting in the open within that filthy place where humans had lost all dignity and life. Although he doesn't fully understand hunting or survival in the forest, Ju-won realizes that there is one unchanging truth at that moment. He knows perfectly well that his experienced master is sincerely trying to train him so he can survive as a hunter. Without hesitating for another second, Ju-won releases the heavy bowstring. The fast arrow slices through the air with strength and surgical precision, flying directly toward the monster trapped in the snare. The arrow tears straight through the wild beast's leg, making it release a sharp, deafening scream of pain that echoes throughout the forest. Ju-won stares in disbelief for a moment, surprised that he actually landed such a precise shot. Before he can process it, the old hunter coldly orders him to fire another arrow. Shocked, Ju-won asks if he really has to shoot it again. Without hesitation, the veteran tells him to aim for the beast's front legs, making Ju-won realize that this painful lesson is an essential part of becoming a true hunter. Suppressing every ounce of pity he feels, Ju-won steadies his breathing and thinks only about the safety of his wife and daughter. He releases another arrow. A loud scream erupts through the forest as blood splashes across the ground. The shot lands perfectly once again. Ignoring the beast's desperate cries, Ju-won prepares another arrow, repeating to himself that these are simply the sounds of an animal, nothing more. This time, he fires with absolute determination. His only goal is to protect his family and give them a better life. The arrow flies forward and pierces the monster's glowing eye before it can even react. Watching the beast collapse, Ju-won realizes something important. He no longer cares if this path turns him into a demon or even an assassin. As long as his family is safe, nothing else matters. He knows he could have ended the beast's life with the very first shot, but dragging out its suffering was part of his training. Cruel as it may be, hunting is not about kindness. It is a brutal struggle where only the strong survive. At that moment, Ju-won swears that he will never forget the merciless lesson he learned today. Afterward, the old hunter tells him to gather every rabbit they hunted before heading home. Ju-won is surprised by the order, but after seeing the old man smile, he respectfully bows and thanks him sincerely for his generosity. Just as they are about to leave, the veteran points toward the last rabbit hiding somewhere in the forest and tells Ju-won to capture it. As Ju-won picks up the heavy cloth bag, he peeks inside and discovers a frightened little rabbit with soft brown fur that is still alive. Noticing that this rabbit looks different from the others, the old hunter tells him to hurry and catch it properly. The following morning, warm sunlight shines across their peaceful cabin. While carving a piece of wood with a sharp knife, Ju-won reflects on his previous life. Back then, he never dreamed of having a family, so he never had a reason to work toward anything. But now everything is different. For the first time in his life, he has people worth protecting. As he continues working, his attention suddenly shifts toward a small wooden box sitting on the table. Opening it, he discovers several wooden plates engraved with letters from the local language. His eyes immediately light up. Realizing this could help him learn to read, he excitedly rushes over to the old hunter and, using his broken vocabulary and hand gestures, asks his master to teach him. The old hunter looks genuinely surprised. The young man actually wants to learn how to read. After scratching his head for a moment, the veteran sighs and finally agrees. Walking over to an old wooden chest, he searches through his belongings and explains that proper writing materials will be necessary. Moments later, he hands Ju-won everything he needs. Filled with gratitude, Ju-won eagerly begs him to begin the lessons immediately. The old hunter leads him to the table, and the young hunter happily follows while tightly holding a beautiful black quill. Soon, Ju-won begins practicing the unfamiliar characters on yellowed sheets of paper. Silently watching him, the old hunter can't help but wonder why such a mysterious man is so determined to learn how to read. Looking at the writing supplies brings back old memories. Long ago, he bought them while dreaming of becoming a noble's servant. He spent countless hours learning to read and write, only for fate to lead him down a completely different path. Shaking away those painful memories, he decides that his military past should remain buried forever. Later, the old hunter gazes out the window toward the deep forest. With spring arriving in the mountains, goblins will soon become far more active and dangerous. Even though Ju-won lacks experience, the veteran admits that the young man learns incredibly fast and would already be a valuable companion for any adventurer. A sharp pain suddenly shoots through his injured leg. To him, it feels like a warning. His long-awaited reunion with the goblins is drawing near. Consumed by years of hatred and vengeance, the old hunter silently vows to slaughter every single goblin that crosses his path. Meanwhile, back at the peaceful cabin, the atmosphere couldn't be more different. Lizzie happily cuts pink fabric while sewing a beautiful new outfit for little Dorothy. When Dorothy asks the same question once again, Lizzie laughs and reminds her how many times she has already asked it, making the little girl shyly shrug. Suddenly, a loud creak comes from the front door. Curious, Lizzie calls out for her husband. Ju-won steps inside with a warm smile, only to be greeted by Dorothy, who runs straight into his arms. Excitedly, the little girl proudly shows off her brand new dress, and Ju-won can't help smiling at how adorable his daughter looks. As he gently sets a large cloth bag on the floor, everyone notices something strange. The bag starts moving all by itself. Lizzie immediately cries out in surprise. Dorothy's eyes sparkle with excitement as she asks if it's some kind of magic trick. Ju-won simply smiles and says it isn't. Still carrying Dorothy in one arm, he untees the bag with the other while Lizzie comes over to help. Then, two long ears slowly pop out from the opening. Dorothy's golden eyes grow wide before she excitedly shouts that the little animal really moved. The moment she realizes it's a rabbit, she squeals with happiness. Unable to contain herself, she rushes forward to pet it. However, Lizzie quickly stops her, deciding to remove the frightened animal herself so no one gets hurt. With incredible gentleness, Ju-won carefully lifts the tiny creature from the bag. The instant the rabbit fully appears, Lizzie gasps so dramatically that she actually falls backward onto the wooden floor. Dorothy stands completely mesmerized, staring at the adorable little creature with sparkling eyes. She excitedly points at its head, saying this rabbit looks completely completely different from every rabbit she has ever seen, because sitting right there was a tiny horn. The little horned rabbit slowly stands on its hind legs and quietly looks around its new home. The moment Dorothy spots the strange little rabbit, her eyes light up with excitement. To her, it is the cutest thing she has ever seen. But Lizzie reacts very differently. She immediately calls out for her daughter to stay back, warning her not to get too close. A rabbit with a horn is no ordinary animal. In this world, creatures like that can be dangerous and incredibly aggressive. Determined to keep Dorothy safe, Lizzie slowly approaches the little rabbit with both hands stretched forward. Her body trembles with nervousness as she suddenly lunges to catch it. But something unexpected happens. The little rabbit doesn't resist at all. Instead, Lizzie easily scoops it into her arms without it trying to bite or attack her. The whole situation feels strange. A wild, magical beast should never be this easy to capture. Curious, she brings the tiny creature closer for a better look, and that's when she notices the real reason. The poor little rabbit is shaking nonstop. One of its tiny paws is badly injured, with fresh blood slowly dripping from the wound. Seeing the helpless animal suffer makes Dorothy's eyes fill with tears. She immediately turns toward Ju-won and cries out that the little rabbit is hurt. Hearing those words, Ju-won's expression instantly changes. Without wasting another second, he walks over to Lizzie and gently asks her to hand the frightened little rabbit to him. Trusting her husband completely, Lizzie carefully places the trembling creature into his hands, hoping he can save it. Holding the tiny rabbit with incredible care, Ju-won quietly focuses his mind. A moment later, a warm, brilliant light begins flowing from his palms. The magical glow completely surrounds the little rabbit, gently wrapping around its body as the healing spell takes effect. Seconds later, the wound disappears completely. Not only is the injury gone, but the rabbit also stops trembling, finally free from its pain. Dorothy can barely contain her excitement. She jumps up and down with sparkling eyes, proudly declaring that her father is the most incredible man in the whole world. Trying to hide how proud he feels, Ju-won simply coughs with a goofy smile while his little daughter rushes over and hugs his muscular leg as tightly as she can. He kneels down, preparing to release the rabbit back into the wild. But before he can, Dorothy suddenly shouts for him to wait. She happily asks her father to place the little rabbit inside instead. Smiling at her kindness, Ju-won gently places the tiny horned rabbit into the basket. The little creature immediately curls up comfortably, and within moments, peacefully falls asleep. Dorothy can only stare in amazement at how adorable it looks. Ju-won points toward her with a gentle smile. Not understanding what he means, Dorothy tilts her head in confusion. Lizzie chuckles before translating. "Your father wants you to take care of the little rabbit yourself." Dorothy freezes for a second, then an enormous smile spreads across her face. She excitedly promises that she will protect the little rabbit, take care of it every single day, and give it all the love and affection it deserves. The family gathers around the basket together as Dorothy gently pets the rabbit's tiny head. Watching the heartwarming scene unfold, Lizzie and Ju-won exchange loving smiles, silently appreciating the peaceful life they have built together. As the hours pass, the cold, star-filled night slowly blankets the quiet cabin, hidden deep within the forest. Inside the bedroom, Dorothy sleeps peacefully beneath her warm blankets, while the rabbit's basket rests safely beside her pillow. Meanwhile, Ju-won quietly reflects with Lizzie. Humans are incredibly greedy. Even after obtaining everything they once dreamed of, they always end up wanting more. He remembers the day they escaped from that prison wagon and found this lonely cabin. Back then, simply having a place to live was enough. But after Dorothy was born, he expanded the cabin so she would have plenty of room to run, play, and grow up happily. Ju-won finally opens up and admits that now that he has a real home and a loving family, he wants to learn how to read and write so he can protect them. Looking at Lizzie with a gentle smile, he realizes she is the greatest blessing life has ever given him. As Lizzie patiently practices reading the stone tablets one word at a time, Ju-won quietly watches her. After everything she has done for their family, he feels she deserves a moment to rest. Without saying a word, he walks over and wraps his arms around her shoulders from behind. The sudden embrace catches Lizzie off guard, but the surprise quickly melts into a warm smile. She softly thanks him, whispering that his hands are incredibly warm. Ju-won simply tightens his embrace, silently expressing everything he cannot put into words. His hands gently slide lower, making her feel completely safe, before pulling her into an even closer hug. Lizzie's cheeks instantly turn bright red, but she doesn't pull away. Instead, the couple quietly enjoys the peaceful moment together beneath the soft glow of the lantern. Eventually, the candle burns out, leaving the room covered in darkness as the two remain in each other's arms. The following day, several carriages travel toward the great city where the information broker lives, a journey that takes nearly a day and a half. Inside one carriage, the village chief grumbles that they have only been traveling for half a day, yet his entire body already feels stiff. While complaining about the expensive fare and the fee they must pay the broker, he convinces himself it will all be worth it. After all, healing mages are usually weak and helpless, but Ju-won is different. The old man remembers the mountain hunter's enormous physique and cannot recall ever seeing someone so unbelievably powerful. A greedy smile spreads across his face as he estimates that information this valuable should easily earn him more more than 10 gold coins. Meanwhile, another passenger asks whether they should also attempt to summon a hero. His companion immediately replies that the kingdom has already tried several times without success. The conversation then shifts to the strange rumors spreading across the land. According to the temple, a hero has already appeared somewhere in the world. The man remains skeptical, questioning whether the hero serving the enemy nation is actually genuine. He argues that blindly trusting ancient legends makes no sense, and if the enemy's hero is nothing more than a fraud, the truth will eventually come out. Listening carefully, the village chief suddenly remembers something terrifying. Their village sits dangerously close to enemy territory. If war breaks out, they could be caught in the middle at any moment. Realizing the danger, he decides they must sell Ju Wan's information as quickly as possible and leave before an invasion begins. Back at the cabin, little Dorothy happily tries to wake up her tiny horned rabbit, excitedly telling it they are going to play together. Lizzie walks into the room and jokingly reminds her daughter that the little rabbit isn't food. Dorothy looks completely confused before telling her mother not to be silly because everyone knows baby rabbits aren't meant to be eaten. Laughing, Lizzie points out that Dorothy is practically drooling all over the poor animal. Embarrassed, the little girl quickly wipes her mouth before rushing outside to gather food for her favorite rabbit, leaving Lizzie amused by her endless energy. The moment Dorothy steps outside, she notices a brand new fence and wonders why her father is building another one when they already have a house. A second later, she remembers why she came outside in the first place. She skips over to the wooden rabbit pen with a bundle of fresh green leaves and looks at the rabbits. Even now, she still thinks they're big, ugly creatures. Holding up the leaves, Dorothy proudly announces that lunchtime has arrived. She even tells the rabbits that she's extremely busy today, so they'll have to eat politely without bothering her. But the instant she places the leaves into the feeder, something unbelievable happens. The pile of leaves suddenly multiplies all by itself. Dorothy freezes in shock. There are now far more leaves than she originally brought. Her eyes sparkle with excitement as an incredible thought crosses her mind. Could she actually use magic too? Her imagination runs wild as she pictures herself multiplying piles of delicious wolf meat until she stands triumphantly on top of a mountain of food like a powerful magician. Completely delighted by the fantasy, Dorothy happily celebrates beside the rabbit pen. Inside the cabin, however, Lizzie faces a much more difficult problem. She quietly holds the wolf pelt in her hands, knowing the merchant caravan should arrive very soon. Selling it would give them desperately needed money. Merchants always pay well for quality wolf pelts, but that wolf was Ju Wan's very first hunt. She simply cannot bear to sell something with so much sentimental value. Even so, reality is cruel. Ju Wan still needs proper clothes. He needs decent shoes. Their home still lacks water containers, cooking pots, and countless other daily necessities. Looking over at the single rabbit pelt drying on the floor, Lizzie realizes it won't be nearly enough to cover their expenses. After thinking carefully, determination fills her eyes. She ties her long, beautiful brown hair into a high ponytail. Then, she slowly reaches toward the metal scissors lying on the floor. Moments later, Ju Wan's voice echoes from outside the cabin, calling out that Dorothy is already playing in the yard. The little girl immediately runs over and throws herself into her father's arms, receiving a warm smile in return. Lizzie walks outside and gently asks whether he has already finished his work in the forest. But the instant Ju Wan looks at her, he completely freezes. Lizzie now stands before them with her hair cut incredibly short, leaving both Ju Wan and Dorothy speechless. That is tough. I preferred her with long hair, but she is still gorgeous. Ju Wan murmurs his wife's name in complete shock, unable to believe what she just did to her own hair. Completely stunned, he asks where all her beautiful hair went. Lizzie lets out an awkward little laugh, already realizing she may have made a mistake. Even little Dorothy crosses her arms and pouts, complaining that her mother's long, shiny hair was so beautiful. Meanwhile, Ju Wan can't stop blaming himself. To him, this isn't just a haircut. It feels like another painful sacrifice Lizzie was forced to make just to survive. He slowly walks toward her with a worried expression, before gently placing his hand on her cheek and softly brushing her short hair. Then he apologizes for making her go through something like this. That single sentence completely catches Lizzie off guard. She remembers that most women in this world grow their hair simply so they can sell it whenever money becomes scarce. It is something people consider completely normal, but Ju Wan doesn't care about the money. All he sees is the pain and sacrifice his wife had to endure. His gentle voice is so warm and sincere that Lizzie suddenly feels tears welling up in her eyes. Before she realizes it, she wraps both arms around his neck and hugs him as tightly as she can. These aren't tears of sadness. They're tears of pure happiness. I absolutely love this couple. If you want a sweet wife like Lizzie, smash that like button and leave a comment. While little Dorothy watches the two of them with the biggest smile on her face. A little while later, the family resumes their journey toward the nearby village. Dorothy happily invites her mother to sit on the wooden seat Ju Wan carries on his back, but Lizzie politely refuses, saying she would be too heavy for him. Ju Wan simply smiles. Carrying Dorothy is already effortless, and adding another person doesn't seem to bother him in the slightest. Dorothy happily rides on his back, waving excitedly while pointing toward the village and urging everyone to hurry. Before long, the mountains surrounding the settlement come into view, along with rows of wooden buildings where merchants gather for local trade. As they enter the village, lively streets filled with merchants, travelers, and townspeople spread out before them. Dorothy immediately becomes excited by the delicious smell of food drifting through the air and happily runs ahead of her parents. Ju-won quietly looks around the bustling streets, trying to remember the last time he walked through such a crowded place. Then he realizes it was probably Christmas back on Earth before he was reincarnated. Watching countless strangers pass through the stone-paved streets reminds him of his old life, where he always walked alone among endless crowds. But now everything has changed. His wife walks beside him, matching every step. His daughter happily skips ahead, smiling brighter than ever. For the first time in a very long while, Ju-wen truly understands the joy of peacefully walking together with his family. Dorothy's curiosity soon leads her toward the merchant's stalls. She stops in front of a stand filled with large clay pots and excitedly asks if they can look around. The merchant loudly advertises his products while Dorothy stares around in amazement at all the interesting items on display. Just then, a little blonde boy wearing red clothes with bright blue eyes appears nearby. The two children stare at each other with equal curiosity. Dorothy points at him and innocently blurts out a comment, leaving the poor boy completely confused. Watching the scene, Lizzie laughs and says Dorothy really looks a lot like Ju-won, making him quietly wonder if that's actually true. Soon afterward, Lizzie places the braid she cut from her own hair onto a merchant's counter, hoping to sell it for some coins. The gray, bearded merchant carefully inspects it. The moment he sees it, he immediately realizes it is healthy, shiny, and extremely valuable. But greed quickly takes over. Pretending to be uninterested, he claims that pelts have flooded the market lately and that their value has dropped dramatically. His goal is simple: buy everything for as little as possible. Completely unaware that the merchant is lying, Lizzie becomes discouraged, believing her sacrifice won't even earn enough money to buy decent supplies. But standing silently behind her, Ju-won instantly sees through the man's deception. An overwhelming pressure suddenly fills the stall. The merchant immediately stiffens. Feeling Ju-won's terrifying presence behind him, he quickly changes his attitude and begins praising the incredible quality and size of the pelt. "That is it, bro. Do not let him rip off our waifu." Without wasting another second, Ju-won calmly reaches forward and takes Lizzie's braid back, ending the unfair negotiation. The merchant cries out in pain, shocked by the incredible strength in Ju-won's grip. Looking directly into the merchant's eyes, Ju-won calmly tells Lizzie they will simply sell everything in another village, because he can see the lies in that man's eyes. The cheating merchant is left completely speechless. Lizzie hesitates, worried that the next village is very far away, but Ju-wen simply reassures her with a calm smile. For someone as strong as him, that distance is nothing. The merchant is left completely shaken. He realizes that this massive man is not only incredibly strong, but also impossible to bargain with. No matter what trick he tries, Ju-won refuses to back down. Ju-won calmly explains to Lizzie that the rabbit pelt is actually in excellent condition and that the merchant was trying to deceive them from the very beginning. Hearing that, Lizzie immediately understands the situation. The desperate merchant quickly tries to defend himself, claiming that he was only offering the current market price. But Ju-won instantly exposes his true intentions, pointing out that he simply wanted to buy everything for a ridiculously cheap price. Realizing he is about to lose such valuable merchandise, the merchant finally gives in. He hurriedly offers to include salt, a cooking pot, and even a full set of men's clothes just to save the deal. But Lizzie has already seen through his greed. She grabs Ju-won's hand and firmly questions why the merchant insists on acting so dishonestly. Without giving him another chance, she tells her husband they should leave and find an honest shop that will pay a fair price. Ju-won offers to carry Lizzie on his back since the next shop is quite far away. However, she smiles warmly and assures him that she can walk perfectly fine on her own. Watching the couple walk away with such high-quality merchandise, the merchant begins to panic. He desperately stretches out his arm, begging them to wait, but the couple never even looks back. Still holding hands, they calmly continue walking together, completely ignoring every desperate plea behind them. Meanwhile, Dorothy proudly points toward Ju-won while showing him off to the other children at the fair. "That is my father." She repeats those words over and over with an enormous smile until Lizzie finally calls her to come along. As they head home, Dorothy happily runs right behind her parents, proudly telling everyone she meets that the amazing man ahead is her father. Wrapped comfortably inside Ju-won's warm coat, Dorothy slowly begins to doze off. She smiles to herself, thinking that her father's scent always makes her feel completely safe. No matter what happens, she knows her strong super dad will always protect her. Half asleep, she suddenly wonders why everything feels so warm. Then she remembers. Only moments ago she had been freezing from the cold. Now she is safely snuggled inside Ju-won's warm embrace. A moment later, Dorothy suddenly remembers something important. Her little rabbit. She quickly pokes her head out from the coat and excitedly asks Ju-won to put her down, because she has to feed her beloved little pet immediately. Ju-won gently kneels down and carefully places his daughter on the ground. The little girl immediately runs toward the cabin as fast as her tiny legs can carry her. She happily gathers a pile of fresh green leaves with both hands before rushing toward the wooden pen. Finally, it is time for her little rabbit to eat. But the moment she looks inside, her smile instantly disappears. The wooden pen is completely empty. Dorothy freezes in total shock. The fresh leaves slip from her tiny hands and scatter across the ground. Only seconds later, she bursts into heartbreaking tears. Hearing her loud crying, Lizzie immediately rushes over and asks what happened. Through her tears, Dorothy sobs that the rabbit has disappeared. Lizzie looks inside the pen herself. It really is empty. Seeing that, she also becomes heartbroken while Dorothy continues crying and desperately begs for the little rabbit to come back. The commotion quickly reaches Ju-won. He rushes out of the cabin, worried something terrible has happened. Lizzie explains that the rabbit escaped. Ju-won pauses for a moment. So this is the reason both of them are crying. Completely confused, he asks why Lizzie is crying too. Still sobbing, she honestly admits that she became incredibly sad after the rabbit disappeared. Ju-won can only stare at the two of them with complete disbelief. He simply cannot understand how both of them managed to cry this much over a rabbit running away. Then, he completely loses it. A loud burst of laughter echoes through the area. The more he looks at the crying mother and daughter, the harder he laughs. Dorothy immediately starts hitting his leg with her tiny fists while angrily declaring that she hates him. But instead of getting upset, Ju-won only finds her even more adorable. Watching the two of them together, he smiles warmly. Ju-won realizes something. For the first time in a very long while, he can genuinely laugh from the bottom of his heart beside the people he loves most. Meanwhile, deep within the dark forest, far away from their peaceful home, the old mentor of Greenhood quietly watches from behind a gigantic rock. After an exhausting search, he has finally found it, the secret hiding place of the goblin. The goblin's glowing red eyes scan the darkness as it lets out a terrifying growl, completely unaware that an old hunter is secretly watching from the shadows. The elderly man grips his weapon, tempted to charge in and wipe them out right then and there, but he quickly forces himself to stay calm. Rushing in alone would only get him killed. The cave is packed with goblins. Even if he defeats a few, countless more would swarm him in seconds. He knows goblins aren't that dangerous individually. Compared to other magical monsters, they're actually considered weak, but their greatest strength is numbers. They hunt in massive packs and reproduce as fast as rabbits, replacing every loss in no time. These monsters are infamous for kidnapping women from nearby regions, forcing them to increase the size of the goblin horde. Every victim suffers a cruel and tragic fate deep inside those dark caves. Spring is approaching, and with it, the goblin's instincts will only grow stronger. That means there's only one option left. The entire nest has to be destroyed before it's too late. But even Gus knows he can't accomplish such a mission alone. There is only one person capable of taking on a horde like this, Ju-won. The old man sighs quietly. Every time he teaches the young hunter, Ju-won looks at him with nothing but sincere gratitude. The thought of dragging him into such a deadly battle weighs heavily on his conscience. Still, there is no other choice. Turning away from the cave, Gus disappears into the forest, convinced that only the giant hunter can stop the coming disaster. The following morning, Lizzie slowly wakes up, stretching her arms before letting out a sleepy yawn. She begins preparing for another day of household chores when she notices a familiar silhouette returning from the woods. It's Ju-won. Curious about what he brought home this time, she walks outside toward the storage shed. The moment she opens the door, her eyes go wide. Two enormous rabbits are hanging upside down inside. She stares at them in complete disbelief. "Did you hunt rabbits again today?" Ju-won nods while picking up a small hatchet before calmly explaining how everything happened. Earlier that morning, he had spotted one of the incredibly fast rabbits sprinting across the lush green grass. Thinking he could catch it alive, he reached out with one arm, only to completely lose his balance. After landing safely several meters away, the rabbit even turned back to look at him, as if it were laughing at his embarrassing fall. Ju-won's face instantly darkened. He brushed the dirt off his clothes and clenched his teeth. At first, he wanted to capture the rabbit alive, but after being mocked like that, he completely changed his mind. No more holding back. Determined to teach that cheeky rabbit a lesson, Ju-won exploded forward, charging through the forest at incredible speed. Back in the present, however, he conveniently leaves out the part where he fell flat on his face. Instead, he simply tells Lizzie it was a quick and easy hunt. Completely convinced, Lizzie happily claps her hands, praising her husband's incredible hunting skills without suspecting the truth for even a second. Lizzie happily asks whether they should roast the fresh meat or season it with salt first. Ju-won suggests salting it, but Lizzie immediately decides to roast it instead, somehow concluding that she can simply make a roast with salt. Her innocent logic leaves Ju-won completely speechless, but seeing how excited she is to cook for the family, he can only smile. When she promises to prepare the most delicious meal they've ever had, Ju-won admits he can barely wait to taste it, making her even happier. As the meat slowly cooks over the campfire, Ju-won notices the gentle scent of bamboo mixing with the food, convinced that even the vegetables will become more flavorful. But just as everything seems perfect, the flames suddenly begin dying out. Not wanting dinner to be ruined, he casually creates a tiny flame on the tip of his finger and tries to relight the firewood. Looking at the small spark, he can't help thinking that his fire magic is actually pretty ordinary, useful in certain situations, but nothing incredible. He simply points his finger toward the campfire, hoping to strengthen the flames a little. Instead, boom, a massive explosion of fire erupts without warning, completely swallowing the meat in gigantic flames. Ju-won panics instantly and desperately shouts for the fire to stop before his family's dinner turns into charcoal. Completely confused, he begins replaying everything that has happened since gaining this strange power. Then one important memory suddenly clicks. Back when he fought the wolf, the flames didn't come from his body. They appeared directly on the target. That would also explain why his own body has never been burned by his magic. Curious to test the theory, Ju-won crouches beside the meal and closes his eyes. Instead of trying to control the fire itself, he simply imagines gentle warmth surrounding the rabbit meat, slowly cooking it until it's perfectly tender and golden brown without burning a single piece. After concentrating for several moments, he finally opens his eyes. The result leaves him stunned. The flames are wrapping around the meat exactly as he imagined, roasting every side with unbelievable precision. His theory was right. His fire magic doesn't obey his hands. It obeys his imagination. For the first time, Ju-won completely understands how his new ability truly works, and he proudly finishes preparing the perfect roast using nothing but his magical control. When dinner is finally served, Dorothy's eyes immediately light up with excitement. Lizzie takes one deep breath and praises the incredible aroma. Ju-won effortlessly tears the juicy roast in half with both hands, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam before serving generous portions to both his wife and daughter. The two don't hesitate for even a second. They take enormous bites. The moment the flavor reaches their mouth, both of their faces brighten instantly. Lizzie smiles with complete satisfaction, while Dorothy's sparkling eyes declare this to be the greatest meal she has ever eaten. Watching the two happily enjoying his cooking fills Ju-won with an emotion he has never experienced before. At that moment, he realizes true happiness isn't eating. It's watching the people he loves enjoy the meal he prepared. Later that day, Ju-won continues practicing his fire magic outside the cabin. After several attempts, he successfully learns to ignite flames on objects nearly half a meter away. Looking down at his own hands, Ju-won quietly promises himself that with healing magic in one hand and fire magic in the other, he'll have everything he needs to protect Lizzie and Dorothy from any danger. He even begins wondering if the mysterious Santa from Earth gave him these powers for exactly that reason. If that's true, then when Christmas comes, he'll prepare a special feast as a way of thanking the strange old man who completely changed his life. Just then, Dorothy suddenly runs out of the house carrying the little horned rabbit inside its basket. The adorable creature has finally woken up. With endless excitement, Dorothy begins giving her new pet a grand tour of the cabin, proudly pointing toward the stone stove and explaining that it's the kitchen where every delicious meal is made, while whispering that it's now a very important member of the family. Then she happily introduces the wooden walls before carrying it over to Lizzie. Holding the rabbit close to her mother's face, Dorothy proudly announces that this is her mother and that the little rabbit must never forget her. At that exact moment, Ju-won walks back inside. Dorothy immediately runs toward him, lifting the basket high into the air before proudly introducing her father to the rabbit. Then she suddenly declares something that completely catches everyone off guard. She proudly says, "The little rabbit is her little sister." Ju-won freezes. Completely confused, he asks what she means by that. Meanwhile, Lizzie quietly watches from the background, nervously blushing while avoiding eye contact. Something about Dorothy's words immediately triggers a strange thought inside Ju-won's mind. His heart begins racing. He quickly walks over to Lizzie, staring at her in complete disbelief. Could it really be possible that inside her small, fragile body, there was already a new life growing? Overwhelmed with emotion, Ju-won slowly kneels before his wife and gently places his hand on her stomach, silently imagining that their baby is already on the way, and Lizzie can only stare at him in complete surprise. However, noticing the misunderstanding, Lizzie quickly shook her head and explained that she wasn't talking about having a baby. It was simply a misunderstanding. Hearing that, Ju-won let out a relieved sigh before smiling to himself. Even so, the thought lingered in his mind. One day, he truly wanted to have a child with Lizzie, but only after they had escaped this harsh life. He wanted to raise a family somewhere safe, where they would never have to worry about starving or fighting to survive. Before he could think any further, Dorothy suddenly tugged on his sleeve. Looking down, he found her staring at him with an innocent smile, curiously asking why he was kneeling on the ground. The moment Ju-won saw her adorable face, every concern instantly disappeared. More than anything else, he wanted to become the father Dorothy had never truly had and give her all the love she deserved. At that moment, Dorothy happily lifted the little horned rabbit into the air, laughing as she pointed out that Ju-won was making the exact same pose as the bunny. Chuckling, Ju-won looked at the rabbit and finally noticed something surprising. The horn on its forehead had grown much larger than before. When he first found the rabbit, he hadn't thought much about it. In a world filled with giant wolves, terrifying monsters, and mysterious magic, a rabbit with a single horn hardly seemed worth worrying about. But now, a serious expression slowly appeared on his face. He couldn't help wondering whether it had really been the right decision to keep raising such a strange creature. In fact, there had been plenty of times when he had considered abandoning it in the forest. There were even moments when he thought about killing it before it became something dangerous. But every single time, his eyes landed on Dorothy. She was hugging the little rabbit with the brightest smile on her face, completely attached to it. Lizzie had also refused to get rid of the animal, leaving Ju-won with no choice but to accept it as part of the family. Besides, except for the horn, it behaved exactly like an ordinary rabbit. Soon, his thoughts shifted toward the mysterious old man. If the old hunter were here, Ju-won would finally be able to ask what kind of creature the rabbit really was. However, another concern quickly surfaced. It had already been 5 days since the old man last visited. His gaze slowly dropped toward his own hands. At that moment, another thought entered his mind. Once he was absolutely certain that revealing his healing magic wouldn't bring danger to his family, he wanted to heal the old man's injured leg. After everything the hunter had done for them, it was the least Ju-won could do to repay his kindness. A warm smile spread across his face as another possibility crossed his mind. Since they had no relatives in this world, perhaps the old man could one day become a grandfather to Dorothy and a father figure to Lizzie. But that smile didn't last long. His expression soon became serious again. From everything he had witnessed so far, magic users were unbelievably rare. If people discovered that he possessed healing magic, countless problems would surely follow. That was why he needed to master one thing first, using magic without anyone ever realizing it. Closing his eyes, Ju-won began visualizing a completely different method. Instead of creating flames on the outside, what if the fire only burned from within? If he could make that happen, no one would ever suspect magic had been used. Taking a deep breath, he stretched out one hand toward a nearby pile of firewood before imagining the inside of his body glowing like molten lava. Several seconds passed. Finally, Ju-won slowly opened his eyes. Nothing. The firewood remained exactly the same. Frowning, he wondered whether his fire magic simply wasn't powerful enough or whether he had imagined the process incorrectly. Looking at his hand, he couldn't help sighing in disappointment. It seemed he still had a long way to go. But just as he was about to give up, a faint crackling sound echoed across the yard. The pile of firewood suddenly burst into flames from the inside. Without wasting even a second, he grabbed a nearby bucket of water and immediately poured it over the burning logs. Steam exploded into the air as the flames disappeared. For several moments, Ju-won simply stood there, staring at the soaked firewood. Then, a huge smile spread across his face. He had actually succeeded. The flames had ignited entirely from within the logs without producing visible fire on the outside until the wood itself caught. His experiment had worked perfectly. Just then, Dorothy's cheerful voice interrupted his excitement. She happily ran over to tell him that Lizzie had already prepared rabbit meat for dinner and that the food was getting cold. Seeing her rush toward him, Ju-won quickly caught her before she could trip. Smiling, he gently reminded her not to jump around like that because it was dangerous. Dorothy simply giggled before urging him to hurry. Unable to refuse, Ju-won smiled and carried her toward the house. However, just before entering, something unusual caught his eye. Looking toward the mountains, he noticed huge flocks of birds circling high above the forest. His expression immediately stiffened. Ever since arriving in this world, he had never seen birds behaving like that before. Something was happening deep inside those mountains. Unfortunately, before he could investigate any further, Dorothy reminded him once again that dinner was getting cold. After giving the mountains one final suspicious glance, Ju-won decided to eat first. But the moment they reached the house, a familiar voice suddenly called out from outside. The voice belonged to the old man. Surprised by the unexpected visit, Ju-won immediately stepped outside. After all, the hunter always visited at dawn, making his appearance at this hour highly unusual. The old man's attention immediately fell on the newly built fence surrounding the house. Curious, he asked why Ju-won had built it. Ju-won explained that the mountains were home to dangerous wolves, and strangers could be just as threatening. The fence was simply another layer of protection for his family. Without wasting any more time, Ju-won asked what had brought the old man here so suddenly. The answer caught him completely off guard. The hunter had come to teach him how to make a bow. Although surprised, Ju-won quietly listened as the old man explained that he wouldn't be making a complete bow today. Before Ju-won could ask anything else, the old man suddenly interrupted him. There wasn't any time to waste. Without questioning him further, Ju-won immediately followed the hunter back to his cabin. The moment they arrived, the old man grabbed a thick log and an axe before beginning the lesson. Instead of splitting the log with one powerful swing, he first carved a sharp wooden wedge before placing it on top of the log. Then, he slowly hammered the wedge deeper and deeper. Each strike widened the crack a little more until the entire log naturally split into two perfect pieces. Watching carefully, Ju-won finally understood the secret. Rather than relying on brute force, the old man used patience and technique to let the wood split itself. Hours passed. Even after returning inside the cabin, the old man continued teaching one survival technique after another, insisting that Ju-won remember everything. That's when Ju-won finally realized something wasn't right. The old man had originally said he was only going to teach him how to make a bow, but instead, he was passing down every survival skill he knew. It almost felt as though he was preparing Ju-won for a future where he wouldn't be there anymore. Unable to ignore the strange feeling any longer, Ju-won finally asked the old man whether something had happened in the mountains. He explained that, earlier that day, he had seen large flocks of birds circling high above the distant peaks, making him feel as though something was terribly wrong. The old man calmly denied that anything unusual had happened and casually suggested that a wolf had probably attacked someone in the mountains. Without changing the subject any further, the old man walked to the corner of the cabin and picked up a finished arrow. Handing it to Ju-won, he instructed him to use it for practice before announcing that he would continue the the lessons another day. Ju-won respectfully accepted the gift with both hands and sincerely thanked the old hunter for everything he had taught him. As Ju-won turned and walked away, the old man silently watched his back for several moments. Only after Ju-won had gone did the old hunter quietly reveal what had really happened. A few days earlier, he had traveled down to the nearby village and informed the village chief that he had discovered a goblin settlement hidden within the mountains. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the village chief had immediately sent his own son to a nearby town located nearly half a day's journey away. That town was home to a branch of the Adventurers Guild. Although it wasn't a particularly large branch, the guild had a reputation for responding extremely quickly whenever goblins were involved. Because of that, the old man believed they would soon post an extermination request and dispatch experienced adventurers to deal with the threat. If everything went according to plan, those adventurers should arrive within the next few days. His thoughts immediately returned to the strange flocks of birds Ju-won had mentioned earlier. Those birds, they weren't circling randomly, they were scavengers gathering around human corpses. The old man already had a good idea where the tragedy had taken place. Not long ago, he had discovered a group of 5 or 6 people secretly living deep within the mountains, hiding dangerously close to the goblin settlement. To him, the outcome had been obvious from the beginning. Most likely, one of the women in that group had caught the goblins' attention. The moment that happened, their fate had already been sealed. Everything that had been quietly building beneath the surface was about to explode. And once that happened, the disaster would inevitably spread beyond the mountains and eventually reach the nearby village as well. After spending an entire lifetime surviving in these mountains, he had accepted one cruel truth. Sacrifices were sometimes unavoidable. Looking back toward the direction Ju-won had left, the old man quietly admitted that he wasn't particularly worried about him. Among all the people he had met, Ju-won possessed both the strength and the determination necessary to survive almost anything. Even if fate dealt him a devastating blow, even if Lizzie were to lose her life, the pain would eventually fade. As cruel as it sounded, as long as Ju-won survived, he could always find another companion. He could build another family. Those words weren't spoken out of malice. They were simply the harsh reality the old man had learned after surviving countless years as a hunter. Then, his thoughts shifted toward himself. According to the old hunter, every hunter eventually reached the greatest hunting ground of all after walking the same lonely path for long enough. For someone who had devoted his entire life to hunting, there was no greater happiness. Without another word, the old man calmly raised the sword into the air. Then slash! The blade cut cleanly through the air with terrifying speed, demonstrating that despite his age and injured leg, the old hunter's skill had never faded. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Lizzie quietly stepped outside, wrapping a thick sweater tightly around herself as the freezing morning wind brushed against her face. Not far away, Ju-won was carefully inspecting the wooden fence surrounding their home. With winter drawing closer, he wanted to make sure every post was firmly secured before the weather became even harsher. The moment he noticed Lizzie approaching, he immediately turned around in surprise. Concerned by the cold, he wondered why she had come outside instead of staying warm inside the cabin. Rather than answering, Lizzie simply smiled and held out a small wooden bowl she had prepared for him. Ju-won gratefully accepted the meal before gently urging her to return indoors, worried that she might catch a cold. However, Lizzie softly shook her head. She wanted to stay with him until he finished eating. Those simple words caught Ju-won completely off guard. A faint blush spread across his face as he smiled without even realizing it. The two quietly sat beside the small campfire, enjoying its comforting warmth while the cold wind continued rustling through the surrounding trees. After taking a bite, Ju-won couldn't help smiling. The food was delicious. Lizzie immediately became flustered, modestly insisting it was nothing and admitting she was simply happy that he enjoyed it. Ju-won didn't respond. Instead, he quietly admired her smiling face as the dancing flames reflected in her eyes. At that moment, only one thought filled his mind. He couldn't believe someone like him had been blessed with such happiness. Without saying a word, Ju-won slowly moved behind Lizzie before gently wrapping both arms around her shoulders. Leaning close, he quietly thanked her for everything she had done for him. Lizzie's cheeks instantly turned bright red. She gently placed her hands over his and softly admitted that she was even more grateful to have him by her side. Neither of them spoke again. They simply remained together, listening to the gentle crackling of the campfire while enjoying the peaceful warmth they had found in each other's company. For just a brief moment, it felt as though nothing else in the world mattered. The following morning, Ju-won and Lizzie stood beside the nearby stream, washing clothes together. Seeing him helping with the laundry, Lizzie apologized, insisting that she could handle everything by herself. Ju-won simply smiled and continued scrubbing another piece of clothing, explaining that finishing together would be much faster. Watching Lizzie continue working without a single complaint despite the freezing water, Ju-won couldn't help feeling guilty. He couldn't believe she had been doing such exhausting work all by herself this entire time. Before he could say anything, a cheerful voice suddenly called out. Dorothy came running toward them, with the little horned rabbit happily hopping beside her. The moment she arrived, she excitedly reminded Ju-won that it was time to treat the bunny. Only then did he remember. As he reached down to pet the rabbit, something immediately caught his attention. Dorothy was proudly holding a tiny handmade cloth doll. She happily explained that Lizzie had made made it for her the previous day. Ju-won smiled warmly, praising the adorable little doll before finally placing his hand on the rabbit's soft fur. The instant he touched it, a faint golden light suddenly spread across the rabbit's body. Ju-won's eyes widened in shock. Even more surprising, the rabbit's horn completely disappeared. Completely confused, he immediately recalled the conversation he had shared with the old man while practicing archery the previous day. According to the hunter, horned rabbits were a type of demonic beast commonly found throughout forests and open fields. Although wild demonic beasts were extremely dangerous, those raised from a very young age eventually became harmless companions. In fact, many people even kept demonic beasts as pets. But the old man had never mentioned anything about their horns glowing. That made Ju-won wonder whether there were different kinds of horned rabbits, or whether this particular rabbit was somehow unique. Staring directly into the rabbit's eyes, he jokingly questioned whether it was some kind of strange mutant. Even so, his playful expression quickly became serious. No matter what the rabbit truly was, he silently warned it not to ever place Lizzie or Dorothy in danger. In response, the rabbit simply twitched its ears before letting out a tiny squeak. Ju-won immediately froze. Before he could think any further, Dorothy suddenly tugged excitedly on his sleeve. She wanted him to give names to the little bunny and her handmade bunny doll. Watching her eager face, Ju-won couldn't help smiling. Since they already had a little girl named Dorothy, it only seemed fair that her two little companions should have names as well. After thinking for a moment, he finally made his decision. The baby rabbit would be called Oz, and Dorothy's handmade bunny doll would be called Toto. The moment Dorothy heard the names, her entire face lit up with excitement. She happily hugged both Oz and Toto, while repeatedly calling their names over and over again. Watching Dorothy laugh so innocently filled Lizzie's heart with warmth. Quietly smiling to herself, she felt grateful that Dorothy could finally experience the peaceful childhood every child deserved. However, while happiness filled the small cabin deep within the mountains, an entirely different atmosphere had settled over the nearby village. A heavy sense of unease spread through the streets as villagers gathered together in small groups, whispering anxiously to one another. Rumors were spreading from house to house at an alarming speed. Some claimed that goblins had already been spotted nearby. Others feared it was only a matter of time before the monsters attacked the village itself. The growing panic was becoming impossible to ignore. Another villager nervously recalled stories his grandfather had told him many years ago. According to those stories, goblins were ruthless creatures that slaughtered everyone in their path, while sparing only the women. The horrifying thought instantly drained the color from everyone's faces. Some villagers immediately questioned whether they should abandon the village before it was too late. Others admitted they were already too terrified to even sleep at night. Little by little, panic began consuming the entire village. Meanwhile, the village chief was making preparations of his own. Standing beside an old public carriage, he impatiently demanded to know whether it had been cleaned yet. His wife, already exhausted from scrubbing the dusty wooden wheels, couldn't hide her frustration any longer. She complained that no one ever used the carriage, making the extra work feel completely pointless. To make matters worse, everyone else's responsibility had somehow become hers alone. The village chief immediately lost his temper. If the goblins attacked the village, that carriage would become their escape route. Still confused, his wife questioned why they couldn't simply use their own cart instead. The village chief quickly lowered his voice before carefully checking that nobody else was listening. If they loaded their personal cart with supplies, the villagers would accuse him of abandoning everyone to save himself. Instead, he secretly instructed his wife to quietly stock the public carriage with food whenever no one was watching. Although reluctant, she eventually agreed before walking away. The moment she disappeared, the village chief clenched his fists in frustration. Nothing was going according to his plans. His meeting with the information broker had ended in complete failure. Everywhere he went, people kept asking the exact same question. How powerful was the healing mage? The question alone irritated him. Didn't they understand how unbelievably rare a healing mage actually was? Meanwhile, deep inside the mountains, the old man silently observed the goblin settlement from behind a patch of thick bushes. Several goblins were viciously attacking one another, swinging crude clubs, and tearing into each other with savage growls. Watching the scene unfold, the old man immediately realized something had changed. Goblins were naturally violent creatures that constantly fought among themselves. But this wasn't an ordinary fight. It was a mutiny. Their suppressed hunger, their uncontrollable instincts, their endless lust, everything they had been holding back had finally exploded. The old man knew exactly what happened next whenever a goblin mutiny broke out. The defeated goblins would be driven out of the tribe, and there was only one place they would go afterward: a nearby human village. A village filled with women. His expression immediately darkened. It was happening far sooner than he had expected. If the goblins attacked before the Adventurers Guild arrived, his entire plan would collapse. Slowly, his hand slipped into his pocket and rested on a small hidden object. For a brief moment, he wondered whether it was finally time to use the trump card he had been saving for a situation exactly like this. But another problem immediately surfaced. Where could he divert the goblins? What location would be the most suitable? As he searched for an answer, a single face suddenly appeared in his mind. Dorothy, the quiet little girl who rarely smiled. He remembered how she always hid inside the house whenever strangers came to visit. She looked like a child who had forgotten how to smile altogether. For the briefest moment, a trace of guilt crossed the old man's face, but it disappeared just as quickly. He forced himself to remain completely rational. From his perspective, Dorothy wasn't connected to the village at all. She was simply the daughter of outsiders. In his mind, Ju-won, Lizzie, and Dorothy had always been sacrifices meant to protect everyone else. His thoughts slowly drifted back to his younger days. He remembered something his own father had once told him. His father had regretted raising him as a hunter from such a young age. Although he had become a flawless hunter, he had failed to become an ordinary human being. Because he had never experienced a normal life, his father believed he would spend the rest of his life trapped in loneliness. But even now, the old man still rejected those words. To him, his life had been perfect. He had devoted himself entirely to a single purpose, and achieving that goal was worth sacrificing everything including his own life. To a hunter like him, there was no greater joy than pursuing the ultimate hunt. A faint smile slowly appeared on his face. Now, he finally had a disciple, someone worthy of inheriting every hunting technique he had mastered throughout his life. Ju-won would become the seed that carried his legacy into the future, and through that young man, the old man believed he could create the ultimate hunter. However, the moment he returned his attention to the goblin settlement, his smile completely vanished. The goblins had already begun moving, and their destination was the village. Just then, a strange sound suddenly echoed from inside his pocket. His eyes immediately dropped toward the object hidden within. Elsewhere in the forest, Ju-won crouched beside one of his snares after discovering another rabbit caught inside. Without hesitation, he drew his dagger. With a single swift movement, he ended the rabbit's suffering. As he calmly wiped the blood from his blade, he quietly realized something about himself. He was no longer hesitating. The disgust he once felt after taking a life had almost completely disappeared. Looking silently at the rabbit lying before him, Ju-won finally understood why. Without even noticing, he had slowly begun adapting to this world, changing, growing, doing whatever was necessary to survive. As he continued walking deeper into the forest, another thought suddenly crossed his mind. Back on Earth, he had never been this kind of person. Glancing farther into the woods, a small smile appeared across his face. There was still plenty of time before he needed to return home. Perhaps taking a different route today wouldn't be such a bad idea. He might even discover a few new locations perfect for setting additional snares. What Ju-won didn't realize was that this single, ordinary decision would soon place him on a path capable of changing everything. Ju-won continued making his way through the dense forest, carrying a small wooden stick in one hand. He used it to push aside the bushes and vines blocking his path as he ventured deeper into the mountains. The farther he went, the quieter the surroundings became. There wasn't a single sign that another human had ever set foot in this place. It was true wilderness, completely untouched by human presence. After searching the area for quite some time, Ju-won finally sighed in disappointment. It seemed like there was nothing useful to be found here, so he was about to turn around and head back. But just then, something suddenly shot past him at incredible speed. Ju-won immediately spun around and focused on the moving figure. A massive road deer had burst through the trees and was disappearing deeper into the forest. His eyes widened when he saw its enormous size. A deer that big would provide far more meat than the wolf he had caught last time. Without hesitation, Ju-won grabbed the bough hanging over his shoulder. There was no way he was going to let such valuable prey escape. He quickly pulled out an arrow and locked his eyes onto the fleeing deer. He knew that if he remained calm and focused, he had a chance of hitting it even while it was running. Taking a deep breath, Ju-won began chasing after the deer while drawing his bowstring. The deer effortlessly weaved between the trees, but Ju-won refused to lose sight of it. He continued closing the distance. He was almost within range when disaster struck. His foot suddenly caught on a thick tree root hidden beneath the fallen leaves. Ju-won lost his balance and crashed heavily onto the ground. The arrow slipped from his fingers, and when he finally looked up again, the deer had already disappeared deep into the forest. Damn! Disappointment filled his face as he slowly got back on his feet and dusted himself off. However, while looking around, something unusual caught his attention. Several footprints were visible across the forest floor. Ju-won immediately crouched down to inspect them. The footprints were clearly not human, and they were unlike anything he had ever seen before. His expression became serious as he studied the tracks. Judging by how clearly they were still visible, they didn't seem to be very old. Without wasting any time, Ju-won decided to follow them deeper into the forest. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the mountains, an old man was running as fast as his aging body could manage. His breathing had become heavy, and sweat poured down his face as he desperately pushed himself forward. Behind him, a large group of goblins was chasing after him with bloodthirsty expressions. But this entire situation was actually part of the old man's plan. While running, the old hunter reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bag filled with fine powder. Without slowing down, he scattered the powder across the ground behind him. The powder immediately spread through the air. It was musk deer powder, a substance with a unique and incredibly potent scent. For goblins, especially those already overwhelmed overwhelmed by their instincts. The smell was more than enough to drive them completely insane. The moment the goblins caught the scent, their eyes became even redder, their growls grew louder, and instead of slowing down, they charged after the old man with even greater fury. Seeing that his plan was working perfectly, a satisfied smile briefly appeared on the old hunter's face. He continued leading the goblins toward the exact location he had chosen, back in the forest. Ju-won continued following the mysterious footprints. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, carefully tracking every mark left behind. However, with every step he took, the uneasy feeling in his chest continued getting stronger. Something about the situation felt terribly wrong. His instincts were warning him that danger was approaching, yet he couldn't explain exactly why. Even so, Ju-won continued following the trail until he eventually reached the edge of a rocky cliff. Looking down, he noticed that the strange footprints continued along the path below. He then raised his head and looked into the distance. Although this was the first time Ju-won had traveled this far, he could roughly determine where the path led. His eyes widened. The direction of the footprints was leading straight toward his home. The realization immediately sent his heartbeat racing. Without wasting another second, Ju-won jumped down from the rocks and began sprinting at full speed. He didn't know who the footprints belonged to, but one thing was certain: whoever had left them was heading directly toward his home, and that was where Ri and Dorothy were. Fear, unlike anything Ju-won had experienced before, completely took control of his mind. He pushed his exhausted body beyond its limits, running as fast as he could while ignoring every branch that scratched against his skin. The thought of losing another person he loved filled him with desperation. As he ran, his voice became filled with pain as he begged God to protect them. He couldn't understand why the people he cared about had been given to him if they were only going to be taken away again. He desperately prayed that God would protect Lizzie and Dorothy. Meanwhile, far away from Ju-won and completely unaware of the approaching danger, Dorothy was happily standing beside the cooking pot outside the cabin. She was spending time with the little rabbit beside her, but the little rabbit immediately began hopping toward the food. Dorothy puffed out her cheeks and stopped it from eating before everyone else, playfully treating it like a naughty bunny. She gently picked up the rabbit and reminded it that it was already in trouble. Then she proudly showed Oz its tiny handmade bed. The little bed had been made by Mommy and was brand new, making Dorothy happy as she showed it off. Afterward, Dorothy looked toward the front gate. She wanted to be there when Daddy returned so she could greet him. Inside the cabin, Lizzie smiled warmly at her daughter and reminded her to be careful outside and not to forget what Daddy had taught her. Dorothy confidently nodded, assuring her that she hadn't forgotten. She then happily ran toward the yard, completely unaware of the danger approaching with every passing second. She remembered how happy Daddy became whenever she welcomed him home, which was why she never wanted to miss greeting him. Then suddenly, a loud series of knocks echoed from the gate. Dorothy's eyes immediately lit up. Thinking that Daddy had finally returned from the forest, she excitedly rushed toward the entrance. But just before she could unlock the gate, she suddenly remembered Ju-won's warning. He had taught her that she must always check who was outside before opening the door, because it could be a dangerous person. Dorothy realized that she had almost forgotten his warning for a moment. She quickly took a deep breath and carefully leaned toward the narrow opening in the wooden gate. She knew that whenever Daddy came home, he would lower his face so that she could see him clearly, allowing their eyes to meet immediately. So, Dorothy slowly peeked through the gap. The cheerful expression on her face instantly disappeared. The person standing outside wasn't Ju-won. Instead, a hideous green face with bloodshot eyes was staring back at her. The goblin's mouth was stretched into a twisted grin as it glared directly at the terrified little girl. Dorothy immediately realized that this wasn't Daddy. Her entire body froze. The goblin slowly reached one clawed hand through the gap, trying to grab her. Dorothy's heart began pounding violently. She knew she had to run, but fear had completely taken control of her body. Her feet refused to move, and tears instantly filled her eyes. The goblin pushed harder against the gate, desperately trying to force its way inside. But at that exact moment, Ju-won finally burst out of the forest at full speed. His breathing was ragged, and every muscle in his body was screaming from the nonstop sprint. The moment he looked toward the front gate, his heart nearly stopped. A goblin was standing directly outside his home, reaching toward Dorothy. There was no doubt that it was a goblin. Ju-won didn't have even a second to think. There was no time to draw his bow. There was no time to aim. At that moment, protecting Dorothy was the only thing that mattered. He desperately shouted her name, and his voice echoed throughout the mountains. He sprinted forward with every ounce of strength remaining in his body. He ordered the goblin to get away from his front door before launching himself into the air, using every bit of power in his legs. Ju-won twisted his body and delivered a devastating flying kick directly into the goblin's head. The impact sent the creature flying several meters before it slammed violently into the ground. Ju-won didn't even stop to check whether the goblin was dead. He immediately rushed toward Dorothy to make sure she was safe. The moment Dorothy heard her father's voice and realized he had arrived, she finally broke down. Ju-won gently stroked her head and reassured her that he was there and that she no longer needed to be afraid. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. him. But that relief lasted only a few seconds. A chorus of terrifying growls suddenly echoed throughout the surrounding forest. Ju-won slowly lifted his head. His expression instantly froze. One goblin appeared, then another, then 5, then 10, and soon, dozens of goblins began emerging from the trees. They surrounded the cabin from every direction. Ju-won's heart sank as he realized there were far more enemies than he had expected. Without taking his eyes off the approaching monsters, he carefully moved Dorothy behind him and ordered her to stay inside and not come out. He tightened his grip around his sword. The familiar weight of the blade steadied his racing heart. The fear inside him slowly transformed into burning determination. His eyes filled with killing intent as he stared at the goblins surrounding his family. There could be dozens of them. There could even be hundreds. But Ju-won no longer cared. He was prepared to slaughter every last goblin surrounding his home and leave not a single one alive. Lizzie called Dorothy's name from behind, and the moment she spotted her, she rushed over and pulled her into a tight embrace. Seeing Dorothy safe and standing in front of her caused all the fear she had been suppressing to finally burst out. Dorothy also began crying as she said, "Mom, it's Dad. Dad is here." Although the immediate danger had passed and Dorothy was safe, her heart was still trembling. She was overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't fully understand. Deep down, she wondered why she was crying when her father was still fighting alone against so many monsters. She couldn't stop thinking about her old father, who had died in the mountains, and the terrifying possibility that the same thing could happen again. The thought of Ju-won disappearing filled her with overwhelming fear. Meanwhile, countless goblins continued charging directly toward Ju-won without the slightest hesitation. With his massive axe firmly gripped in both hands, Ju-won relentlessly cut down one monster after another. Every powerful swing sent another goblin crashing to the ground. However, as the battle dragged on, Ju-won's own body began to bleed. Even after slaughtering many more goblins, he noticed something unusual. None of them appeared frightened. No matter how many goblins he killed, the others didn't retreat or hesitate. Instead, they continued advancing toward him with sinister, twisted smiles still plastered across their faces. The moment Ju-won noticed those expressions, he finally understood what was really happening. These goblins weren't targeting him. Their actual targets were his wife and daughter. The realization instantly changed Ju-won's expression. Without giving the goblins another moment, he charged toward them and roared. At that exact moment, a massive wave of blazing flames erupted around him. The fire spread across the battlefield, striking every goblin caught in its path. One after another, the monsters were swallowed by the scorching inferno, their bodies burning as the relentless flames consumed them without mercy. The scene then shifted back to Dorothy and Lizzie. The two stood together in terror, unable to look away from the chaos unfolding around them. Suddenly, they noticed several goblins attempting to force their way through the fence beside them. As the monsters drew closer with every passing second, Lizzie immediately panicked and ordered Dorothy to get inside. She urgently told her to lock the door and hide underneath the bed. Dorothy looked back at her mother and worriedly asked what would happen to her. Lizzie didn't hesitate. She told Dorothy that she was going to help her father and urged her to get inside as quickly as possible. But by then, another goblin was already closing in on Lizzie. Knowing there was no time left to waste, she raised her voice and shouted for Dorothy to get inside immediately. With her husband still fighting desperately outside, Lizzie quickly grabbed a long bamboo spear. Only one thought filled her mind. Ju-won was fighting dozens of goblins by himself. Even if she couldn't do much, she at least had to stop the monsters that were trying to break into their home. She had to help her husband in whatever way she could. Gathering all her strength, Lizzie thrust the bamboo spear directly toward the approaching goblin. The spear struck the monster's arm, causing blood to spill from the wound. But despite the attack, the goblin barely reacted. It simply reached out and grabbed the spear with one hand. Lizzie's heart sank when she realized that the weapon wouldn't move at all. Meanwhile, Dorothy watched the terrifying scene unfold before her. Her fear only grew stronger as she saw the monsters trying to get inside. Tears filled her eyes, and she became terrified that the goblins would eat her parents and make them disappear. Unable to hold back her emotions any longer, Dorothy collapsed to the ground and repeatedly cried out for her mother and father. Just then, her little pet suddenly dashed forward at incredible speed. Dorothy immediately panicked and shouted for it to come back because it was too dangerous. But the little creature didn't retreat. Instead, it fearlessly jumped onto the goblin and began scratching its face repeatedly, refusing to back down despite the danger. The unexpected attack gave Dorothy a small spark of hope. She became excited and began cheering for her brave little companion, urging it to keep fighting. Lizzie also watched the scene unfold. At that exact moment, Ju-won noticed the goblin that had gotten dangerously close to them. Without wasting even a second, he swung his massive axe with tremendous force. The blade cleanly sliced through the goblin's neck. The monster immediately collapsed, while the little rabbit safely jumped back down. Seeing what had just happened, Dorothy's face instantly brightened with excitement.
"That's amazing! Oz, you're amazing!"
Dorothy's going to do her best, too. But before she could do anything else, Dorothy noticed another goblin attempting to climb over the fence. She immediately pointed toward it and warned everyone that there was another monster. Then, looking at her brave little companion, Dorothy declared declared with determination that the two of them were now one body and one mind. After some time, the fierce battle finally came to an end. The once chaotic area became completely silent, with Ju-won standing among the corpses of the defeated goblins. From the other side, he could hear his wife repeatedly calling his name. Ju-won immediately headed toward her and pulled her tightly into his arms. He was relieved to see that she hadn't been injured. As he held Lizzie close, countless emotions overwhelmed him. He wanted to say more, but the emotions were so strong that his voice failed him. Before long, Dorothy also ran over and wrapped her arms around him. Seeing his daughter, Ju-won gently asked whether she had been scared. After finally seeing both of them safe in front of him, he released a deep breath of relief. He quietly thanked God and expressed how grateful he was that everyone had survived unharmed. However, his expression soon became serious again as he looked toward the mountain. The danger wasn't over yet. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. They needed to leave the mountain while there was still daylight. Ju-won knew the goblins might become even more active after nightfall, since humans would be at a disadvantage in the darkness. Once the sun went down, traveling down the mountain would become much more dangerous and confusing. After a brief pause, he warned them that everything would become chaotic once they began making their way down the mountain. Back in his original world, Ju-won had been a terrible student. He was constantly getting into fights, and his grades had been awful. Still, he remembered learning about medieval Europe, where the land was controlled by lords and peasants were tied to the land and exploited throughout their entire lives. Whenever he was completely alone, he used to wonder about who had the more miserable life, those peasants or himself. But there was always someone somewhere who had it worse. The people living in this village were probably trapped there, unable to leave whenever they pleased. Ju-won, however, wasn't in the same position. He had no reason to accept a miserable life or allow himself to become tied to this village. If the villagers tried to keep Lizzie chained to this place, he was prepared to take a horse and carriage by force and leave the village, no matter what it took. Just then, Lizzie appeared in front of him and explained that there was a large unused carriage in the village. If they offered the villagers the wolf pelts they had obtained, there was a good chance they would be willing to trade the carriage to them. From what she said, Ju-won could tell that Lizzie probably understood that the villagers wouldn't willingly allow them to leave either. Even so, she was doing her best to hide her anxiety and prevent him from worrying. Ju-won couldn't help but think about how much weaker she was compared to him. He moved closer to Lizzie and gently pressed his forehead against hers, reassuring her that he would find a way to solve the situation. However, their quiet and romantic moment didn't last long. Dorothy suddenly appeared and began pulling Ju-won downward. He immediately bent down, embraced his daughter, and silently made up his mind to protect both of them no matter what happened. Outside the house, Old Man looked around the area. The scene before him made him realize just how incredible the previous battle had been. He wondered whether the Mountain Keeper had really killed all of those goblins by himself. The burn marks covering the area weren't caused by a torch. The monsters had been burned from the inside out. That realization brought a smile to Old Man's face. He had already witnessed healing magic, and now he had seen fire magic as well. This meant the person responsible was a mage with 2 affinities. The chief had apparently been attempting to sell a healing mage to another lord, but hiding the existence of a mage within one's territory or selling them to another lord was a crime punishable by beheading. In other words, the chief's fate was already sealed. However, Old Man soon realized that the goblins weren't the only thing he had to worry about. In his eyes, the people of this village were even worse. The entire village was complicit. They had knowingly sent a young man who knew nothing about the situation up the mountain, while keeping the truth hidden from him. They had even deceived him in case he attempted to run away. As Old Man turned away from the scene, his hatred toward the villagers reached its limit. He believed that none of them deserved to live. In his eyes, everyone in the village deserved to die, himself included. Meanwhile, Ju-won, Lizzie, and Dorothy were standing outside in the village. Lizzie held her daughter while looking toward the villagers. Suddenly, one of the men pointed toward Ju-won and identified him as the Mountain Keeper. Ju-won immediately noticed that everyone was staring at them. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong. It wasn't simply because of the amount of luggage they were carrying. The entire village seemed tense, as though something serious had happened. Then someone suddenly began shouting angrily at another person, complaining that they were being given nothing more than table scraps while still being expected to go up the mountain. Hearing this, Ju-won began to suspect that these people might be adventurers. However, they looked less like people who had just arrived and more like people desperately trying to escape. Nearby, another man noticed the chief and pointed him out to the others. Based on his clothing, they assumed that he was the Mountain Keeper. The chief immediately turned his attention toward Ju-won and demanded to know what he was doing there and why he was carrying such massive luggage. Ju-won was already furious after everything that had happened, so instead of giving a long explanation, he simply revealed the most important detail. 50 goblins had appeared on the mountain. The chief's expression immediately changed in shock. The adventurers were equally stunned because they had been told there were only 10 goblins. One of them immediately accused the chief of lying. The chief quickly denied it and insisted that the old man had definitely told him there were only 10. Ju-won immediately became suspicious. Those words made him remember what the protector had previously told him. Suddenly, everything began making sense. The villagers had known all along. They knew there were goblins on the mountain, yet they still sent Ju-won and his family there as bait without giving them any warning. Then another realization struck him. Even the old man had deliberately deceived him and forced him into the trap. Ju-won's expression became even darker. Without wasting another second, he turned toward Lizzie and asked where the carriage was. Lizzie immediately pointed toward the area behind the chief's house. The carriage was there. Ju-won started heading toward it, but a man suddenly stepped out from the crowd and attempted to stop him. A deep sense of dread immediately began building in the back of Ju-won's mind. He could feel that something was wrong. Without hesitation, Ju-won struck the man with tremendous force. The impact sent him flying backward before he crashed hard onto the ground. Everyone nearby froze in shock. Ju-won then turned toward the crowd and made it clear that they shouldn't try to stop him anymore. He was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. Despite his anger, Ju-won knew they couldn't afford to waste another moment. Darkness would arrive soon, and they needed to get out of the village before nightfall. Lizzie suddenly noticed something ahead and pointed it out. Following her gaze, Ju-won spotted the carriage. It was large enough for all of them to ride in. He quickly placed Dorothy inside before turning his attention toward the horse. However, Ju-won didn't know how to hitch the horse to the carriage. Lizzie immediately stepped forward and took care of it herself. As Ju-won watched her prepare the horse, he remembered that she had once mentioned how horses were shared in her old village. Perhaps that was where she had learned how to handle them. Just as they were getting ready to leave, a woman suddenly came running toward them. She angrily demanded that they stop because the carriage belonged to her. The woman rushed toward Lizzie and began reaching for her belongings, loudly complaining that her things and food were inside and that they belonged to her. Ju-won immediately stepped between them and pushed the woman away. The force sent her crashing to the ground. The woman looked up in shock and began screaming that the mountain keeper was killing people. Her son quickly grabbed her and tried to pull her away, warning that they would only get hurt even more if they continued. But the woman refused to stop. She continued shouting that those ungrateful brats were stealing their carriage. Ju-won didn't bother responding to her. He immediately lifted Lizzie and placed her inside the carriage before taking his own position at the front. Then he took control of the carriage and started driving toward the village exit as quickly as possible. Even after they had begun moving away, someone behind them continued shouting angrily. Ju-won didn't look back. He simply kept driving forward. But after traveling farther from the village, he suddenly noticed an old man standing directly ahead of them. At the same time, a massive group of goblins came into view behind him. Ju-won's expression immediately changed. He finally understood the truth. It was a trap. They had fallen directly into the old man's carefully prepared trap. Ju-won couldn't understand why they would go this far. His anger continued rising as he looked toward the old man, who was also considered Dorothy's grandfather. The betrayal was impossible to understand. Meanwhile, the old man was already preparing to leave the area, as though he had completed whatever task he had come there to accomplish. The situation had suddenly become even more dangerous. Ju-won finally realized that they had been deceived from the very beginning, and the people he had trusted had deliberately led his family straight into danger. If you're excited for the next part, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to bring it to you as soon as possible.